Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The forest was dense with towering pines, their gnarled branches twisting together like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Rain fell in sheets, a steady rhythm that pounded against the forest floor and splattered on the leaves above. The air smelled of damp earth, moss, and the heavy scent of pine. It was the kind of forest that felt alive, watching, waiting. James had been driving for hours, the winding road stretching endlessly through the wilderness. His headlights cut through the fog like a blade, revealing nothing but the darkness that consumed the world around him. His mind had been clouded with thoughts of the lodge, the invitation he had received so unexpectedly. A friend from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years, had sent it. The message had been simple: "We have a place for you. Come find us." Curiosity had been the thing that pushed him to the edge of the forest, to this moment where the only thing ahead of him was the dark road that seemed to stretch on forever. As he drove deeper, the rain began to fall harder, the tires of his car splashing against the wet asphalt, the windshield wipers working in frantic rhythm to keep up. Eventually he saw it, a faint glow in the distance. The shape of a structure emerged through the mist, its silhouette dark and foreboding. The lodge. The tires of his car crunched over the gravel driveway as he pulled up to the front. The lodge itself was ancient, a massive, dark building with smoke curling from a chimney. The windows were dimly lit, as if the inside held only shadows and secrets. James could feel a strange unease creeping up his spine, but he shook it off. He'd driven this far, he couldn't turn back now. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking into the mud as he walked toward the front door. The rain was relentless, but he could hear the crackling of a fire, the soft murmurs of voices, and something else, something strange. A low, almost inaudible whisper. It wasn't the wind. No, this was something different. James paused for a moment, squinting through the darkness, but all he could see were the towering trees around him and the flickering light from the lodge. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. His hand reached out, gripping the cold brass handle of the door. As the door creaked open, a blast of warm air greeted him, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something older. He stepped inside, his boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. The lodge was dimly lit, the fire crackling in the stone hearth, casting long shadows along the walls. There were a few people sitting around the fire, their faces partially obscured by the low light. "James?" A voice called out from the shadows, and his gaze snapped toward it. A man stood, his face worn and weathered by time. He had a familiar look to him, but James couldn't quite place it. "It's been a long time," the man said, his voice deep and gravelly. James hesitated. "Who are you?" The man chuckled softly. "Don't you remember? It's me, Elias. We were friends once, a long time ago." The name stirred something in James' memory, a faint recollection of youth spent together in places like this one, but it felt distant, like a dream fading from his grasp. A cold chill washed over him. As he took a few steps further into the room, his eyes were drawn to the dark corners, to the shadows that seemed to move unnaturally. A figure in one corner shifted, its face barely visible. The fire crackled loudly, breaking the silence, but in the stillness of the lodge, James could swear he heard the faintest whispering, like voices carried on the wind. The firelight flickered as Elias moved closer, his face inches from James now. "We've been waiting for you," Elias said, his tone almost too calm, too knowing. James swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. The warmth of the lodge felt more oppressive now, like the walls were closing in. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that there was something about this place, and these people, that he didn't fully understand. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the whispering stopped. The air grew still, thick with an unspoken tension. "Sit," Elias said, motioning to the chairs around the fire. "We have much to discuss." James hesitated. The air felt heavy, thick with 1,000 unspoken things. His eyes flickered to the shadows in the corners of the room, to the figures that seemed to be watching him from just beyond the firelight. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to turn around and run out into the rain. But his feet were rooted to the floor, as if some unseen force had anchored him here. He lowered himself into a chair beside the fire, the warmth of the flames offering little comfort. Elias sat down opposite him, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "You've heard the stories, haven't you?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. James nodded, though he wasn't sure which stories Elias was talking about. "What do you mean?" "The forest," Elias continued. "The whispers that come from the trees. The things that walk the woods when the moon is hidden behind the clouds. James frowned. He had heard rumors, vague stories told around campfires by those who had ventured too far into the woods and never returned. But he hadn't thought much of them. They were just stories after all. Elias leaned forward, his eyes locking with James. "It's all true," he said softly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "And tonight you will learn just how true." James' heart raced. The fire crackled again, a loud snap breaking the tension in the room. But it didn't help. The air felt thick with dread, and the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if the forest itself was preparing for something. Then, from the dark corners of the room came a sound. Soft at first, but growing louder. A low, guttural growl. James' breath caught in his throat. The lodge was quiet now, save for the growling sound that echoed through the walls. The fire's light flickered and dimmed. Elias didn't move. He just stared at James, his eyes glimmering with something dark and unspoken. And then the growl came again, closer this time. And this time it wasn't the wind. James turned, his pulse quickening. The shadows in the room seemed to move, to shift, and in that moment he realized something that made his stomach turn. The darkness wasn't just outside. It was already here. The growl reverberated through the lodge, a deep, animalistic sound that seemed to vibrate the very walls. James' heart thundered in his chest, the sensation of impending danger pressing against his ribcage like a vice. He glanced around, but there was nothing, only the fire crackling, its light flickering like a dying star, casting long shadows that twisted and curled across the wooden floor. The growl came again, louder this time, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something alive. James' eyes locked on Elias, but the man remained unervingly still, his expression unreadable. It was as if he was expecting this, as if he knew exactly what was about to unfold. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the hair on the back of James' neck stood on end. His gaze shifted back to the dark corners of the room, where he thought he had seen movement. "Do you hear that?" James finally managed to choke out, his voice tight with fear. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached over and threw another log onto the fire, watching as the flames leapt higher, casting a brief glow on the room's many strange, weathered objects. The room seemed to stretch outward in all directions, but its size was impossible to judge in the half-light. It was as though the lodge itself was bending and shifting around them, growing larger, darker. "The forest is waking up," Elias said finally, his voice almost a whisper, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "It calls to us even now." James' brow furrowed. "What do you mean, calls?" "Calls how?" But Elias only smiled. It wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a slow, knowing grin, like a man who had seen too much and understood too little. The growl came again, much closer now, and this time it wasn't just a sound. There was a shift in the air, a weight. Something moving just beyond the edge of the firelight. James stood up abruptly, his legs shaky as he took a step back, his eyes darting toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the door. The door was ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind pushed against it, sending a cold draft into the room. James felt it immediately, an unnatural cold that seeped into his bones. The warmth from the fire did nothing to fend it off. It was as though the lodge itself was rejecting him, pushing him further into the unknown. A flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a brief moment, James saw something through the door, just outside in the dark. A figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the forest. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched far longer than they should have. The figure was still as stone, its face hidden in the shadows, but James could feel its gaze burning into him. A shiver ran down his spine, and his breath caught in his throat. "What is that?" he whispered, the words trembling on his lips. Elias turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the figure in the distance. He didn't seem surprised by its presence. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "You're about to find out," Elias said, his voice hollow. Before James could respond, the growl came again, this time louder, more animalistic. The creature outside had moved, its massive form shifting through the rain like a predator hunting its prey. It wasn't just one thing. It was many. He could hear others now, their movements too quick and too erratic to be anything human. James' pulse hammered in his ears, and instinctively, he backed away toward the hearth, his eyes locked on Elias, whose face had now taken on a different expression, one of solemn resignation, not fear. "You don't have much time," Elias said, his voice calm, too calm for the circumstances. "They'll be here soon." "Who?" James breathed, his voice strained with disbelief. "Who will be here? What is this?" You came here to escape, didn't you? Elias asked, his voice heavy with meaning. Escape from the world. From everything you ran from. But this place is different. This place has a way of pulling people in. It brings them closer to the things they've tried to forget. The things they've hidden from. The things they can never outrun. James blinked, his mind racing to catch up with the words, but it was all too much, too fast. I don't understand. What do you mean? Elias stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes locking with James. The forest remembers. The forest holds the weight of every lost soul. Every regret. Every mistake. You may think you've come to find peace here, but this place? It's only the beginning of what waits for you. There was a sudden, sharp noise from the door, like claws scraping across wood. James turned sharply, his stomach twisting with fear. Someone, was scratching at the door. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. The growling had intensified, now accompanied by the low thud of something massive moving just outside. The shadows at the edges of the room seemed to stretch, as though the walls were closing in on them, suffocating the space. Elias moved toward the door, his steps measured, almost too calm. He didn't look back at James. His hand rested on the door's handle, and for a brief moment, James thought he might try to open it. But instead, Elias paused, his fingers lingering on the cold metal. He turned to James. "They're here," Elias whispered. Before James could ask what he meant, the door flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crash. The wind and rain poured in, but the creature outside was closer now. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness, and in that moment, James could see it clearly. It was a figure taller than any man he had ever seen, its limbs long and sinewy, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was obscured by shadows, but he could make out the gleaming yellow eyes that fixed on him like a predator's stare. The growl came again, but this time it was not just a sound, it was a command, a warning. James' body locked in place, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The creature in the doorway took a step forward, its massive form blocking the rain as if it were more than just flesh. It was something ancient, something that belonged to the forest itself. Elias stepped back as if to give the creature space, but his eyes were still focused on James. "It's too late now," he said quietly. "You've already been marked." James' throat tightened. Marked? By what? Elias didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the creature, as if he had seen it 1,000 times before, as if it was something familiar. "Run," Elias finally said. "Run while you still can." But it was too late. The creature lunged forward, faster than James could react, and the room filled with the sound of snapping branches, growls, and something darker, something far more sinister. The creature's growl echoed through the lodge, sending a chill deeper into James' bones than the cold draft from the door ever could. The air was thick with tension, thick with something ancient that lingered in the very air around them. James' heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled backwards, desperate to put distance between himself and the hulking figure that had just entered the lodge. His mind was a blur of panic. He couldn't process it all, the looming figure in the doorway, the strange calmness of Elias, the way the entire room seemed to shift, to twist. The forest outside, with its rain-drenched trees and unseen creatures, felt like it was pressing in from all sides. There was no escape. For the first time in his life, James truly felt trapped. The creature moved, its immense, clawed feet scraping the wooden floor as it took a step inside. Its eyes glowed in the dim light, yellow and predatory. The growl it made wasn't a warning anymore, it was a promise. James could feel the weight of it settle into his chest like a heavy stone. The wind howled outside, the storm now a fury of rain and wind, as though nature itself had joined in the chaos. The fire sputtered, its flames trembling as the lodge's interior grew colder with every passing second. James' body was frozen, his muscles tight with fear. He should have run. He should have bolted when he had the chance. But there was nowhere to go. He tried to move, to think, but his feet wouldn't obey. His eyes flicked between the creature, Elias, and the door, as though each presented a different escape route, none of them viable. Elias was standing motionless, watching the creature's every movement as if it were a natural part of this world. He didn't seem surprised. He didn't seem afraid. Why aren't you doing anything?" James' voice cracked, his panic rising. Elias turned his head slowly, his eyes dark and knowing. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice low, as though trying to keep the terror from consuming him. "You're part of this now. You always have been." The words didn't register at first. Part of this? James couldn't understand. This place, this lodge, was not part of anything he had expected. It wasn't the retreat he had thought it would be. It wasn't a peaceful refuge. It was a nightmare. But the creature wasn't waiting for an explanation. Its massive form loomed closer, its yellow eyes never leaving James. It was only inches away now. The growling seemed to vibrate the very walls of the lodge, the sound deep and primal. "Run," Elias whispered, his voice softer now but no less urgent. Before James could process the command, the creature's long, bony hand shot forward. It grabbed him by the arm, its claws digging into his flesh like iron hooks. A scream tore from his throat as he was yanked off his feet, his body slammed against the cold stone of the fireplace. Pain exploded through his side where the claws had punctured his skin, and he gasped for breath, his vision swimming. He kicked and thrashed, his mind numb with terror as he tried to free himself, but the creature's grip was unyielding. Its strength was unnatural, far stronger than any human could ever hope to be. "Let me go," James shouted, his voice strangled with panic. The creature didn't answer. It didn't need to. It dragged him across the room, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring every second of his struggle. Elias didn't move to help. Instead, he stood there, watching with a look that bordered on pity. The creature stopped in front of the open door, the cold night air howling in from outside. Its eyes flicked down to James, who was now pinned to the floor, breath coming in ragged gasps. "You've been chosen," Elias said suddenly, his voice too calm for the situation. "That's why you're here." James' mind was reeling. Chosen? What the hell did that mean? But before he could ask, the creature gave a low, rumbling growl and released him. James collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping for air. His body ached, his chest ached, his arm throbbed where the creature's claws had torn through his jacket and into his flesh. He looked up, trying to regain his bearings, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The creature was no longer standing still. It was shifting, its form blurring for a split second before it seemed to split into multiple figures, all of them moving in synchrony, weaving in and out of the shadows like wraiths. There was no sound as they moved, just the eerie hiss of the storm outside and the occasional flicker of firelight. James scrambled backward, his hands searching the ground for anything to defend himself with, but all he found were empty wooden planks and shards of stone. The lodge was a trap. There was nothing here to help him. One of the figures, this one larger than the rest, stepped closer. It had the same gleaming yellow eyes, but the face was human, or at least it seemed to be. The features were twisted, distorted, like a mask of melted flesh. "Run," Elias said again, his voice now tinged with urgency. "If you want to survive, you have to run. Now." But it was too late. The creatures had surrounded him, their eyes burning with hunger and something darker. The whispers began again, this time louder, rising from the forest, from the depths of the lodge itself. James' heart pounded in his chest as his body screamed for him to run, but his feet were frozen to the floor. The growls became louder, a chorus of voices rising from all sides. The lodge was alive with them. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the creature lunged forward again, its claws reaching for him. James' legs finally obeyed. He scrambled backward, pushing himself into a standing position and bolting for the door. But it was no use. The creature was faster. It was everywhere. The air thickened with a suffocating weight as the shadows moved, closing in on him from all directions. In the distance, through the storm, James saw something, a flicker of movement at the edge of the forest, a figure standing just outside the lodge. It was a person, a woman, her face obscured by the hood of a cloak. She was staring at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't place. But before he could react, the shadows converged, and the world around him plunged into darkness. The world dissolved into a blur of shadows and cold. James' breath caught in his throat as he stumbled forward, the lodge's walls seeming to close in around him. He didn't know if he was running or just falling, his legs failing him with every frantic step. The growl of the creature echoed in his mind, its sinister rhythm pulsing through his veins, syncing with his racing heartbeat. He was trapped in a nightmare where there was no escape. As he sprinted toward the door, the growls rose in intensity. The shadows reached out for him, fingers of darkness crawling along the floor like living things, intent on dragging him back into the depths of the lodge. The cold from outside seeped into his skin as he reached the threshold, the storm's fury biting at his face. The howl of the wind filled his ears, but behind it there was something else, something worse. The sound of footsteps too heavy to be human. James flung the door open with desperate force, his heart hammering in his chest. The forest was alive with sound, the wind whistling through the trees, the rain pelting down in a relentless, cold barrage. But it wasn't just the storm that screamed at him. There were whispers in the trees, voices too low to understand but too sharp to ignore. They echoed through the air, rising and falling like the sound of distant laughter. He didn't think. His feet were already moving before his mind caught up with the decision. He ran into the storm, his footsteps muffled by the wet earth, the mud clinging to his boots. The wind pressed against him, forcing him to squint, but he didn't stop. The woods were dark, too dark to see much beyond the reach of his outstretched hands, but he could feel them behind him. The creatures. He didn't know how many, but he knew they were there, closing in. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the trees in stark white light. For a brief moment, James saw something that made his blood freeze. There, among the black trunks of the pines, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a creature. It was something in between. A figure, humanoid but stretched, its limbs too long, its face too twisted. It was standing still, watching him. Then, in the next moment, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness again. James didn't stop to think about it. He ran faster, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the rain blurring his vision. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees leaning toward him as if to trap him. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the entire world had paused, holding its breath. The further he ran, the quieter it became, until the only sound was the pounding of his heart in his ears. But then, the whispering returned. It was faint at first, like the rustling of leaves. Then it grew louder. It wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from the ground beneath his feet. The earth shifted. James froze mid-step, his mind fighting to make sense of what he was hearing. The whispers grew louder, rising from the very soil, a chorus of voices overlapping in an incoherent jumble. The air turned colder, the wind dropping to a low, mournful howl. He looked down, his eyes wide with disbelief. The ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. It was moving. The earth was rippling like water disturbed by unseen hands. The whispers were no longer words. They were sounds, low, guttural noises that seemed to emanate from deep below the surface. The ground around him began to crack, small fissures opening up, revealing the darkness beneath. James' breath caught in his throat as something reached up from the blackness. A hand, skeletal, with long fingers that stretched upward, dragging itself from the depths. The ground shook beneath him as more hands emerged, clawing their way toward the surface. The whispers became screams, agonized cries that echoed through the forest, each one seeming to call his name. His legs froze in place. His body screamed at him to move, but he couldn't. He was trapped. The ground was alive, and it was reaching for him. A figure emerged from the center of the dark mass, a shadow tall and shrouded in the same inky blackness. James' eyes widened in horror as the figure took form. It wasn't human, or at least it didn't look it. It had the shape of a man, but its skin was like bark, twisted and gnarled, as if it had been crafted from the very forest itself. Its eyes, or what passed for them, were hollow, empty pits of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around them. The creature's hand, long and spindly, reached for him, its fingers curling like roots pulling at the earth. The air around James grew thicker, heavier, and it became harder to breathe. The creature's voice was low, rumbling from deep within the earth, as though it were speaking through the very soil. "You cannot escape." The words were not just spoken, they were felt, a pulse that vibrated through James' chest, making his skin crawl. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, trapped in the grip of the creature's gaze. The whispers grew louder, the cries more frantic, and then, from the depths of the forest, James heard something else, a laugh. A soft, mocking laugh that seemed to come from all directions, the sound of it curling through the trees like a serpent. Out of the corner of his eye, James saw movement. Another figure, smaller but just as twisted, stepped from the darkness. It was cloaked in shadow, its face hidden by the hood of its tattered cloak. The figure moved silently, its feet barely touching the ground as it glided forward, never once making a sound. The creature, the one that had been speaking, did not acknowledge the newcomer. But James could feel the shift in the air. The tension in the forest grew, palpable and thick, like the calm before a storm. The new figure stopped just behind the twisted man with bark-like skin, its presence like a shadow hanging over him. "She's coming," the figure whispered, its voice like a soft breeze, barely more than a breath. James couldn't take his eyes off the newcomer. Something about the figure was different. There was a sense of familiarity there, something he couldn't quite place. It didn't feel like the other creatures. It didn't feel like the forest itself. It felt human. "Who are you?" James croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head slightly as if considering his question. Then, in a voice that sent chills down his spine, it spoke. I am what you've been running from. I am what you sought to escape. And I am the only one who can show you the way out. James' mind spun. Escape? The only way out? What did that even mean? He had been running for so long, but every step had only taken him deeper into this nightmare. He had no answers, no way to understand what was happening. All he knew was that the shadows were closing in, the whispers were drowning him, and there was nowhere left to go. Will you help me? He asked, his voice trembling, though he didn't understand why he was even asking. What was there to help him now? What was left to save? The figure's eyes glimmered beneath the hood, reflecting the faint light from the sky above. Then it spoke again, its voice a whisper lost in the wind. Not all things can be saved. But if you wish to survive, if you wish to truly leave this place, then you must listen. Listen to the forest. Listen to the truth beneath the earth. James' pulse quickened. What truth? The figure stepped closer, its voice dropping to a mere breath against his ear. The truth that you are not the first to seek refuge in the lodge, and you won't be the last. There are others lost in these woods, just as you are. And with that, the figure stepped back into the darkness, its form dissolving into the storm like smoke in the wind. James was left standing alone, his heart racing, his mind spinning with the terrifying realization that whatever this place was, it had a history far darker than he had ever imagined. And he was a part of it. James stood in the rain, his body frozen by the weight of the words that still echoed in his mind. You're not the first. The figure's words had struck him harder than any of the horrors he had encountered in the lodge. Not the first. But what did that mean? Had others come here before? Had they vanished the same way? Was there something in the forest that had claimed them? The whispers in the trees seemed to beckon him forward, their voices growing louder, more insistent, pulling him toward something. But what? The storm raged around him, the wind howling through the trees, battering his face with sheets of rain. His soaked clothes clung to his body, his legs heavy with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. His feet were already moving, driven by something deeper than fear, deeper than the need for survival. He couldn't explain it. It was as though the forest itself was calling to him, urging him to come closer. His thoughts swirled as he trudged deeper into the woods. The rain had softened somewhat, but the wind still howled through the branches, and the shadows seemed to move just beyond his peripheral vision, always out of reach. The trees were ancient, their trunks wide and gnarled, their branches twisting like the arms of forgotten gods. They loomed over him, their thick canopies blocking out most of the sky, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. With each step, the forest grew darker, the air thickening with an almost tangible weight. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in on him, their branches groaning under the weight of something far older than time itself. He could feel the eyes of the forest on him, hundreds, thousands of eyes, watching, waiting. The whispers, too, had changed. They no longer sounded like distant murmurs. Now they were sharp, urgent, like the voices of people trying to tell him something. The forest was alive with sound, with life, with movement. He could hear things that shouldn't be able to move so fast, so quietly, slithering just out of sight. And every now and then there was the faintest crack, like the snapping of twigs underfoot, but when he turned there was nothing there. Nothing but trees, shadows, and the rain. For what felt like hours, James moved deeper into the forest, drawn by a force he didn't understand. His feet were heavy, his body cold and wet, but he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that he had no choice. He couldn't go back. He couldn't return to the lodge, not after what he had seen, not after what he had learned. Whatever was waiting for him in the forest, whatever the forest wanted from him, it was too late to turn back. Suddenly the whispers grew louder. They rose from the earth beneath his feet, the trees around him, the very air itself. He felt the earth tremble beneath him, a low vibration that seemed to resonate deep in his chest. His heart skipped a beat, the hair on his neck standing on end. He was being watched, not by just one thing, but by something far greater. The trees, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of something much larger, something ancient. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers stopped. Silence. A deep, eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. It was the kind of silence that made James' pulse race, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears until you were convinced you could hear your own blood rushing through your veins. It was as though the entire forest had stopped breathing. In the stillness, he heard it, a soft rustling sound, almost like footsteps coming from somewhere ahead. His stomach twisted in knots, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Something was coming toward him, and this time he couldn't see it. He didn't need to. He could feel it, a presence moving through the forest like a shadow, like a predator stalking its prey. He spun around, his eyes wild with fear, his heart pounding in his chest. But the trees were still. The wind had died down, and the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. There was nothing but the darkness and the trees. But he knew it was there. He could feel its eyes on him, watching him from the darkness. And then he saw it. A shape moving between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, too spindly to be human. Its head was bent low, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, like the eyes of some ancient creature that had walked the earth long before humans had even existed. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones, and its body was covered in a thin layer of dark, moss-like fur. It was silent as it moved, its long arms swinging at its sides, its fingers curling like claws as it took slow, deliberate steps toward him. James froze, his legs trembling beneath him. He couldn't move. His body refused to obey, locked in place by fear. The creature took another step forward, and then another, its eyes never leaving James. The forest around them was still, as though the very air had thickened, as though the world itself had stopped moving. Then, without warning, the creature lunged. James stumbled backward, his feet slipping in the mud, his mind blank with terror. He scrambled to get up, to run, but his body betrayed him. The creature's hand shot out, its long fingers closing around his arm with terrifying speed. The pain was immediate, sharp, and intense as its claws dug into his flesh. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the night, the wind, the rain. The creature's face loomed closer, its eyes gleaming with malice, and for a moment, James thought it was going to rip him apart. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever was to come. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the creature released him. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears that he thought it would burst from his chest. His body was covered in mud, blood dripping from the wound on his arm where the creature had scratched him. The creature didn't move. It didn't advance. It just stood there watching him. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the creature stepped back, retreating into the darkness from which it had emerged. The forest seemed to exhale, the tension slowly lifting as the creature disappeared into the shadows. James lay there for a moment, too stunned to move, too shaken to think. His mind was reeling, his body aching. He wanted to get up, to run, but the pain in his arm and the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air kept him rooted to the spot. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breath. When he opened them again, the forest had changed. The shadows were deeper, more oppressive. The air was thicker, colder. He could feel the presence of something more ancient now, something that had been here long before the creatures. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and he was trapped in its heart. A distant, mournful howl echoed through the trees, and James knew without a doubt that he was not alone. He was in the center of something far older, far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The forest was not just alive. It was conscious, and it was watching him. And there was no escape. The night had become a living thing, pulsating with an energy that vibrated through the forest like a heartbeat. The air was thick, stifling, and James could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. Every breath he took was heavier than the last, as if the very atmosphere was turning against him. His pulse was erratic, the blood pounding in his ears, but beneath it all was something worse, a suffocating silence. The whispers had stopped. The growls, too, had faded into an eerie stillness. But that only made the dread worse. It was as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. James rose slowly from the wet earth, the pain in his arm making it difficult to move. He could still feel the claw marks, deep gashes in his flesh that stung with every movement. His fingers were slick with his own blood, but he didn't have time to think about it. The creature, whatever it was, had disappeared into the shadows, but that didn't mean he was safe. The presence in the forest was still there, still watching. He could feel it in his bones, a cold, creeping sensation that clung to him like a second skin. The forest stretched out before him, dark and endless, the trees reaching high into the night sky like skeletal fingers. The canopy above blocked out most of the stars, but the rain had let up, leaving the earth damp and slick beneath his feet. The ground seemed to shift with every step as though it were alive, moving beneath him, watching his every move. James took a step forward and then another. His legs were shaky, his breath ragged, but there was no turning back. He couldn't go back to the lodge, not after what he had seen, not after what he had heard. The truth had already started to seep into him, crawling into his skin like an infection. Whatever had been hidden in this forest, whatever lay beneath the earth, was waking up. The wind picked up again, the rustling of the leaves like the whispers of 1,000 voices. James didn't know where he was going. He wasn't even sure he wanted to know. But he had to keep moving. He had to find something, anything that could explain what was happening. As he pushed deeper into the woods, the forest seemed to shift around him. The trees that had once seemed distant now loomed closer, their gnarled branches twisting above him, blocking out what little light remained. The path was no longer a clear trail, but a tangle of underbrush and uneven ground. Each step felt like it was leading him farther away from anything familiar, from the world he once knew. The silence returned, but this time, it was broken by something else. A faint sound. Crack. A twig snapping underfoot. James froze. It wasn't the wind. He whipped around, his heart in his throat. Nothing. Just the trees, standing still as ever, their dark silhouettes blending into the night. But then there it was again. A movement. Too fast for his eyes to follow, something darted between the trees, a shadow, a figure. James' breath caught in his throat. He wasn't alone. He wasn't alone. The whispers returned, low and haunting, their voices no longer incomprehensible but slowly becoming clearer. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, but their meaning was unmistakable. You've come for the wrong reasons. You shouldn't have come. James' pulse quickened, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. His body was frozen, his muscles tight with terror, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the forest for any sign of movement. But the shadows were too thick, too deep. Then there was a voice, a single voice that cut through the others, sharp and clear. You cannot leave. James' breath hitched. It wasn't the same voice he had heard before, the one that had whispered warnings in the lodge. This voice was more familiar. It wasn't coming from behind him, but from somewhere ahead, hidden in the dark. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but the words didn't make sense. You cannot leave. The voice didn't come again, but its meaning lingered, suffocating him with its weight. He tried to shake it off, tried to force his legs to move, but the fear had rooted him in place. The forest had swallowed him whole, and now it was playing with him, toying with him, leading him deeper into its heart. He took another step forward, determined now to find the source of the voice. The figure in the shadows had to be the key, had to be something that could explain all of this. Maybe it wasn't a creature. Maybe it was someone who knew what was going on. Someone who could help him understand what had happened to this place. The whispers grew louder, now joined by the distant sound of something else. The faintest thudding. A rhythm. Slow. Methodical. Like the beat of a drum. The path ahead became narrower, the trees crowding in on him, their limbs heavy with rain. A flash of lightning streaked across the sky, casting everything in stark relief for a moment. For a split second James saw it. A shape just beyond the trees. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a creature. It was something else entirely. A figure stood in the clearing ahead, tall and unnaturally still. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were long, too long. It wore a hooded cloak, its face hidden in shadow, but James could feel its eyes on him, piercing through the darkness like twin beams of light. For a moment, everything stopped. The wind, the rain, the whispers, they all faded into the background. The world narrowed down to just this figure, standing there in the clearing, waiting for him. It was as though time itself had frozen, holding its breath as the figure tilted its head slightly, as though studying him. And then, in the silence, it spoke. You've come far. The voice was smooth, soft, almost musical, but there was an edge to it, something ancient and unsettling. It was the same voice that had haunted his dreams, the voice he had heard in the lodge. You, James began, his voice raw, unsure of what to say. You were in the lodge. You spoke to me. Who are you? What do you want? The figure didn't answer immediately. It simply stepped forward, its cloak rustling softly in the breeze, as if it were floating rather than walking. The space between them seemed to stretch, as if the forest itself were pulling them apart, but still the figure came closer. You wish to leave, it said, but the forest has claimed you now. It does not let go so easily. The words sank into James like stone, heavy and immovable. He could feel the weight of them pressing against his chest, as though the very air around him was thickening with their meaning. I don't understand, James stammered, his mind spinning. I don't belong here. I just need to leave. Let me go. The figure's head tilted, a slow, deliberate motion. For a long moment it didn't speak, but when it did, its words were chilling. The forest takes what it desires. It has claimed you for its own. You are a part of it now. No, James gasped, his voice rising in panic. No, I'm not. I just want to leave. The figure reached out with long, pale fingers, and for a moment, James thought it was going to touch him, to pull him into its darkness. But it stopped just short, its hand hovering in the air. It is too late, the figure whispered. There is no leaving now. A cold, deep shiver ran through James. The figure's words didn't make sense. How could it be too late? He had come this far, hadn't he? He had made it this far, and he couldn't let the forest win. He couldn't let it take him. But as the figure's hand fell, the ground beneath him seemed to shift again. The earth groaned and the shadows deepened, stretching toward him like fingers from the underworld. And in that moment, James realized the truth. The forest wasn't just alive. It was ancient. It had always been here. And it had never let anyone leave. The ground trembled beneath James' feet as the figure's words settled into his chest like an anchor, pulling him deeper into the madness of the forest. The trees creaked and groaned as though alive, their limbs moving with an eerie rhythm in time with the ancient force that seemed to wrap itself around him. The whispers returned, louder this time, rising in volume until they became a constant drone, like the low hum of an insect swarm. The air around him thickened, and the temperature seemed to drop by degrees, the moisture in the air turning into a biting chill that sank straight into his bones. The figure was still there, standing just beyond the reach of the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It didn't move. It didn't need to. The very presence of it was enough to bind him, to force him to face the truth of this forest, a truth he had been unwilling to see until now. You don't understand, do you? The figure spoke again, its voice softer this time, almost sympathetic. The forest does not take what it desires, James. It merely chooses. His name. The way it rolled off the figure's tongue made his skin tighten, a shiver running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. He had never told this thing his name. He hadn't even introduced himself to Elias. He knew him. And the realization hit him like a slap to the face. This forest, this cursed place, had been waiting for him. Waiting for someone. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His throat was dry, the weight of the moment suffocating him. You are not the first to walk these woods, James, the figure continued, its voice now taking on a tone of grim amusement. And you won't be the last. There are others like you. Lost. Running from something. Seeking shelter in the wrong places. The forest does not simply give refuge. It demands a price. Price. James croaked, his voice trembling. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet were frozen to the ground, as though the earth itself had claimed him, binding him to this cursed spot. I never asked for this. I didn't know what this place was. The figure's eyes flickered with a trace of something, pity perhaps? Or maybe it was just a reflection of the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Its lips parted slightly, revealing sharp teeth in a grim smile. You didn't need to ask, it said. The forest knows your kind. It knows your secrets. It always knows. You were always meant to be here, James. And you will help the forest grow. The words stung like cold, biting wind. He felt a shudder travel through his entire body as the realization set in. There was no escaping, no going back. The forest was not a place you could leave once it had set its roots in you. You became part of it. You became it. His stomach twisted while rising in his throat. He couldn't breathe. Panic clawed at his chest, and yet the more he struggled, the tighter the grip of the forest became. His mind reeled from the knowledge that no matter how hard he fought, he would never get out. He had already crossed the threshold, already made the mistake of coming too deep into the heart of the hollow. I don't belong here, James whispered, as though the words might free him somehow. He wanted to believe them. Please, I want to leave. I just want to get out. The figure's eyes darkened, and the wind picked up once more, howling through the trees as though the forest itself was responding to his desperation. The whispers grew louder, becoming shriller, more insistent, until they filled his ears with their shrieking demands. No, the figure replied, its voice sharp, final. You belong here. You were called here. The forest does not make mistakes. You must stay. The earth beneath his feet began to pulse again, a low, rhythmic throb that seemed to reverberate through every inch of his body. He felt his heart beat in time with it, his pulse syncing with the beat of the forest, like some terrible, dark symphony. I didn't ask for this. James shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. I don't want this. I'm not like them. I don't belong. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its long, spindly limbs moving with a strange, liquid grace. With each step, the shadows around it seemed to grow longer, stretching toward James like claws in the dark. You will become like them, the figure said softly, as if speaking to a child. You will understand soon enough. But first, you must see the heart of the hollow. The words hit James like a wave crashing into the shore, and his mind began to unravel in response. The heart of the hollow? Was that what he had been running toward all along? The dark center of this twisted forest, the place where it all began? Suddenly, the ground trembled again, but this time it was different. The trees around him began to shift, their trunks groaning as though they were bending and twisting in slow motion. The leaves above rustled as if caught in a wind that was not of this world, the branches creaking and snapping like bones breaking under pressure. The forest was moving, alive with intent. The figure's lips parted into a smile, revealing more of its sharp, jagged teeth. "Come," it said. "The hollow calls you." Before James could react, the earth beneath him opened, a deep chasm splitting the forest floor wide open. A black, gaping void emerged from the ground, as if the very heart of the forest had decided to reveal itself. The shadows within it were not simply dark. They were thick, tangible, like smoke that moved with purpose. The whispers had coalesced into one voice, loud and harsh, echoing from the depths of the chasm. "You cannot leave." The figure moved again, its long limbs reaching out to him, not in haste but with a slow, predatory certainty. It was dragging him toward the chasm, toward the heart of the hollow. James could feel his heart thudding against his chest, every beat a painful reminder that he was still alive, still trapped in this nightmare. His legs moved without his consent, his feet stumbling toward the abyss, pulled by some invisible force. He had no control over his body, no ability to fight back. And then something inside him broke. It wasn't a physical break, but something deeper, something primal. He couldn't explain it, but in that moment he understood. He understood what the forest wanted. It wasn't about survival. It wasn't even about him, really. It was about the forest's hunger, its insatiable need to claim what it was owed. The moment he stepped toward the chasm, the ground seemed to open wider, the darkness deeper. The whispers flooded his ears, their voices a chorus of torment, as if they were guiding him toward something worse than death. He couldn't see the bottom of the chasm. He could only see the shadows and hear the voices, the ancient call of the hollow that had been waiting for him for so long. His heart stopped for a brief second, as if the forest itself had consumed him in that instant, and in the depths of his terror, he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just the forest that had claimed him. It was the hollow itself, and it would never let him go. The chasm before him was no longer just a gap in the earth. It was a yawning maw, a dark, living thing that seemed to breathe with a slow, sickening pulse. It was as if the forest itself had opened its throat and beckoned him forward. The air was thick with an unnatural weight, heavier than before, and James could feel the pressure against his chest, like the world itself was closing in on him. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but the ground beneath his feet felt like it was pulling him deeper, not letting go, drawing him into the heart of this nightmare. The figure, this thing that had led him here, that had watched him like a hunter studying its prey, was still close, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an unsettling calmness. It didn't need to hurry. It didn't need to chase him. He was already lost. James tried to take a step back, but his feet felt like they were stuck in the mud, glued to the earth itself. His heart was hammering in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears, but he couldn't move. He was trapped. The whispers had quieted now, their voices merging into a single unified sound, low, almost soothing, yet impossibly menacing. They called to him, beckoned him, 1,000 voices speaking in one breath. "Come closer. Join us. Become part of the hollow." The figure stepped forward then, moving with an eerie grace, its long limbs stretching out from the darkness like tendrils, its eyes never leaving James' face. It was too close now, too overwhelming, and the stench of the forest, the smell of wet earth, of decay, of rot, was suffocating. "You don't understand, do you?" The figure's voice was softer now, almost gentle. It reached out a hand toward James, its fingers elongated and graceful, but there was no comfort in the gesture. "This place has always been. It has always been waiting for you, for your kind. The forest chooses those who are lost, those who have nowhere else to go, those who need it." James recoiled, his heart racing as his mind struggled to process the figure's words. What was he talking about? He had come to the lodge, hoping for peace, for rest. He hadn't come here to become part of some twisted, living nightmare. "I didn't need this," James forced out, his voice raw. "I didn't choose this." The figure's smile grew wider, its teeth sharp and jagged. "You think you didn't choose? You think you had a choice in the matter? The forest doesn't give you choices, James. It gives you the truth. And the truth is, you were always meant to come here. You were meant to become one with the hollow. The words felt like a weight pressing down on him. His body trembled with a strange, unfamiliar energy, a pull that seemed to be coming from the chasm, from the depths of the forest itself. The shadows around him grew thicker, more oppressive, as though the forest were closing in around him, folding over him, suffocating him with its ancient, living darkness. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. He could feel the darkness creeping inside him, coiling in his chest, settling in the pit of his stomach. It was like the forest had always been inside him, waiting for the right moment to awaken. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling with denial. "No, I won't be a part of this." The figure's laugh was soft, almost pitying, but it sent a shiver down his spine. "You don't have a choice, James. The hollow does not ask for permission. It takes what it is owed, and it always gets what it wants." The ground trembled again, and for the first time James felt it, not just as a vibration beneath his feet, but as something far deeper, something that moved through the very air itself. The chasm before him seemed to pulse with life, its depths growing darker, more oppressive with every passing second. He couldn't see what lay below, but he knew it wasn't just the forest. It wasn't just the shadows. There was something ancient, something old beyond measure. The whispers rose again, not just in his ears but in his mind, echoing like a distant memory of a life he could never remember. "Join us, James," the figure whispered, its voice like velvet, smooth and insidious. "Embrace the hollow. Let it consume you, let it become you. You are part of this world now, and you will never be alone again." His mind was spinning. The words, the sounds, the pull of the hollow, it was all consuming, all encompassing, and the realization struck him like a thunderclap. The forest was not just a place. It was a force that had been waiting for him, for someone like him. The hollow had always been watching, always waiting for the right moment to take its claim. The whispers, the shadows, the creatures, all of them had been building to this moment. And he had walked right into its grasp, willingly or not. And as the figure reached for him, its pale hand coming closer, the darkness seemed to stretch and twist, as though the forest itself were alive, breathing around him. The ground beneath him shifted again, and suddenly he felt himself falling, his feet slipping into the chasm. He reached out, desperate to grab onto anything, but the shadows were too strong, too overwhelming. "No!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the abyss. His body tumbled into the darkness, the world spinning out of control. The air around him turned to cold mist, thick with the smell of earth and rot, and for a moment he couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The weight of the forest pressed down on him, pulling him deeper, and he felt himself sinking into something far worse than death. Then, with a sickening jolt, his fall stopped. He landed with a thud, his knees crashing against cold stone, the air around him heavy with dampness. His chest heaved with desperate breaths, and he blinked, trying to clear the haze from his mind. The darkness around him was so complete that he couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. The shadows clung to him, wrapping around him like a suffocating cloak. And then he heard it. The sound of something moving, something large, something ancient. A low growl, a rumble that came from deep within the earth itself, shaking the ground beneath him. He scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. The growl was closer now, its pitch rising like the sound of a storm before it broke. James didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to run. No escape. He was trapped in the hollow. The growl grew louder, closer. And then, from the deep, suffocating shadows, something emerged. A shape, large, towering, its form indistinct in the darkness, but its presence overwhelming. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as though it were walking through the shadows, through time itself. James couldn't see its face, couldn't make out its features, but he felt it. Felt the power, the ancient weight of it pressing against him. This was it. This was the true heart of the hollow. And now it was awake. The air felt suffocating, thick with the presence of something ancient, something unknowable. The darkness around James was alive with weight, pressing down on him like a physical force. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his heart thudded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder that he was not alone. Not anymore. The growl rumbled through the air again, lower now, closer, vibrating through his bones. The figure, whatever it was moving toward him. James couldn't see it, not clearly. The darkness seemed to distort everything around him, bending the world in ways that made his eyes ache. But he could feel it. He could feel its presence as though it were a force, a weight that dragged at the edges of his mind. His skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The growl reverberated through the very earth beneath him, and the shadows seemed to shift, to move, as though they were part of this thing. Slowly, carefully, James took a step back, his shoes slipping slightly on the slick stone beneath him. He didn't know where he was. Didn't know what this place was or what waited for him in the darkness. But he knew one thing with brutal clarity: he had to get away. He had to find a way out. The hollow, this ancient living thing, was closing in on him, and there was no escape. He spun around, looking for anything that might give him an advantage. But there was nothing. Just the unbroken expanse of blackness, stretching endlessly in all directions. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The only sound was the distant rumble of the growl, growing ever closer. He felt the pressure of it, as though the sound were a physical force, pushing him deeper into the shadows. Another step, then another. His heart pounded louder with each movement, each step taking him farther into the unknown. The floor beneath his feet shifted again, as though the earth itself were alive. The stone, once solid and unyielding, seemed to breathe with a sickening pulse, its rhythm slow but inevitable. And then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible glow. It flickered in the distance, like the dying embers of a fire, casting weak, shuddering light on the walls of the cavern. There wasn't much, but it was enough to see. Enough to realize that the path ahead was not just an endless void. There was something more. Something waiting. He moved toward it, each step hesitant, his breath quick and shallow. The glow beckoned to him, a promise of something. Something familiar, something that might offer an explanation or at the very least, a way out. He couldn't stay in the dark. He couldn't let the growl get any closer. It was almost too much to bear. The feeling of being hunted, of being drawn toward something, toward whatever waited for him in the blackness. The glow grew stronger as he neared, flickering like a pulse, and the closer he got, the more he felt the weight of the hollow pressing on him. The very air seemed to become more oppressive, thicker, like the walls were closing in around him. He could hear the growl now, so close it seemed to echo from the very walls, a sound that vibrated in his chest. His throat tightened and his legs felt weak beneath him. But he had no choice. He had to keep moving. The glow was within reach now, and as James stepped into it, the world seemed to shift. It was no longer a simple flickering light. It was a shape, a mass, glowing faintly with an eerie, almost unnatural radiance. He stepped forward, his eyes widening, his pulse quickening as the light revealed itself for what it was. A figure. At first, James thought it was another shadow, another figment of his imagination. But no, it was real. A tall, thin figure, its body barely discernible against the light but unmistakably human in shape. Its arms were outstretched as though it were waiting for something, waiting for him. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, with patches of darkness where veins seemed to writhe beneath the surface, as though it were some sort of twisted reflection of life itself. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was nothing more than a blur of shadow and light, like it was constantly shifting, constantly changing. It had no features, no eyes, just a dark space where its face should have been. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, beckoning him forward. James felt his body move against his will, the fear inside him growing like a suffocating cloud, but there was something else too, a pull, a compulsion. The figure was pulling him toward it, its presence sinking into his chest like a weight, forcing him to step closer. His feet moved without thought, drawing him into the center of the cavern. "You're here." The voice came low and distant, not from the figure itself but from the space around it, as though the entire cavern were speaking. "At last, you've come to us." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating off the walls, bending in ways that made his head spin. He couldn't think, couldn't focus. The darkness swirled around him, the growls still echoing from the distance, but now they sounded almost far away, faint, almost distracted. The pull of the figure was stronger now, and he found himself standing directly in front of it, the light surrounding them like a halo. "You've come seeking refuge," the voice continued, its tone shifting, becoming something softer, more insidious. "But refuge is not what you will find here. What you will find is something much more." James tried to speak, to find his voice, but nothing came out. His throat was dry and his tongue felt thick, like he was choking on the air itself. His mind raced, his pulse racing, but the figure didn't move. It stood still, its shape flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. What do you want from me?" James finally managed to croak, the words hoarse in his throat. The figure's form seemed to ripple, to warp in the air, as though it were made of smoke. The faint glow around it flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls of the cavern. Then the voice answered, not in words but in feelings. emotions that surged through him like an electric current. Wants you. The emotion was raw, primal, hunger, desire, the insatiable need for something more, something other. The figure didn't need to speak. Its presence said everything. It was pulling him closer, drawing him toward the depths of the hollow, toward something ancient and dark, toward a destiny that had always been his, whether he had known it or not. "You are here to join us," the voice echoed, a whisper that filled the cavern, reverberating in his bones. "You are here to become part of the hollow." A cold laugh echoed in the distance, the sound of it like the crackling of dry wood. And then James felt it, the awakening. It came from below, from deep in the earth, and it rattled through him like a shockwave. The cavern seemed to breathe, to move, and the very walls groaned as though they were alive. The shadows stretched and twisted, and the faint light flickered violently, casting grotesque shapes against the stone. The hollow was stirring. It was waking up. The figure took a step toward him, its arms still outstretched. The air around them crackled, thick with an energy James could feel in his very soul. The ground trembled again, and the voice inside his head became clearer, more insistent. "Join us." James stood frozen in the presence of the figure, his mind reeling as the words echoed in his head, a chorus of voices that rose from the earth itself, from the depths of the hollow. "Join us." The message was as clear as it was chilling, a command that felt older than time, and yet something in James resisted. His body trembled, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Every inch of him wanted to run, to escape, but the weight of the forest, the pull of the hollow, was too strong. It was suffocating him, pressing down on him, whispering promises of an end he wasn't ready for. The figure loomed before him, its form flickering like a shadow, barely solid, barely human. Its arms stretched toward him with an unnatural grace, the long fingers curving as if they were meant to wrap around him like tendrils. The pale glow that surrounded it cast eerie, flickering light across its body, illuminating patches of its skin that looked like it was made of cracked porcelain, and others that looked like the bark of an ancient tree, twisted and gnarled. The figure's face was an unsettling blur, constantly shifting, as if it could never settle on one form. The deep, hollow emptiness of it was a void that seemed to call out to James, pulling him in. A cold, sharp breeze stirred, and James shivered, suddenly aware of how damp the air had become, how thick it felt, pressing against his chest, constricting his lungs. The smell of earth and decay filled the air, suffocating him, making him want to gag. But it was the eyes, or rather, the lack of them, that caught his attention. Those two empty voids, like the deepest, most suffocating blackness, stared at him. No, they didn't stare, they saw him in ways he didn't want to be seen. "You were always meant to be here," the voice continued, not from the figure itself, but from the very air, the walls, the ground beneath him. It surrounded him, wrapping around him like the vines of the forest, strangling him with its unrelenting pull. "You've always belonged to the hollow. It's only a matter of time before you realize it." James swallowed hard, his throat dry. "No, I'm not like you. I'm not like this. His voice faltered, his words swallowed by the oppressive silence that had descended upon the cavern. The figure's form wavered, shifting like it was made of smoke, or perhaps something even more insidious. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped closer, and James could feel it. The ground trembled beneath him. The shadows stretched toward him like fingers, cold and grasping, pulling him into the darkness. "You are like us," the figure said softly, its voice almost tender, as though it was trying to comfort him, to lull him into submission. "You've always been. You've always been part of the hollow." The words curled around James, squeezing the air from his lungs. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was consumed by the overwhelming presence of this thing, this force that seemed to be alive in ways he couldn't understand. It wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a forest. It was something more, something ancient and eternal, something that had been waiting for him. Waiting for someone like him. A wave of nausea swept over him. His legs felt weak, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there on the cold stone floor. The weight of it all was too much to process, too much to understand. And yet, the whispers never stopped, the voices growing louder, clearer, more insistent. "Come closer," they urged. "Let go of your fear. We'll be easier that way. Let us show you what you are meant to become." James squeezed his eyes shut, his hands balled into fists at his sides, as if trying to fight against the pressure, the overwhelming sensation that was swallowing him whole. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape this suffocating grip. But his body wouldn't obey. His feet were planted to the ground, rooted by some unseen force, his body held captive by the hollow's will. And then he felt it, the pull. the deep, insistent tug at the core of his being. It wasn't just in his chest anymore. It was inside of him, a twisting, writhing force that made his stomach churn. The hollow was inside him, its tendrils reaching into his very soul, pulling at the deepest parts of him. He wasn't just standing in the hollow anymore. He was becoming it. "No," James whispered, his voice trembling, barely a breath in the thick air. "No, I won't." The figure's hand shot out, fingers long and thin like roots, curling around his arm with a bone-crushing grip. The touch was cold, unnatural, sending a shock of ice through his veins. He gasped, the air suddenly sharp in his lungs, and looked up, eyes wide with fear. The figure's face was inches from his, and though there were no eyes to stare into, James felt its gaze pierce into his very being, stripping him bare. "You will," it said softly, the voice now thick with something ancient, something dark. "You will come. You will join the hollow." The word settled into him like a seed, burying itself deep in his mind. Join. The word itself was like poison, spreading through his thoughts, through his blood, like a slow-moving illness that he couldn't shake off. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't resist it. And in that moment, he realized something that made his heart stutter in his chest. The hollow didn't just want his body. It wanted his soul. The figure's grip tightened around his arm, and James stumbled, his legs buckling beneath him. He fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The hollow's pull was like a flood, sweeping over him, dragging him deeper into the earth, into the very heart of it. The shadows began to twist, to writhe, stretching toward him like fingers, like the roots of a tree, and the floor beneath him seemed to shift, the stone moving like liquid. The growl rose again, louder now, closer. The darkness in the cavern seemed to churn, to pulse with a life of its own, and in the distance, James could see something moving. A shape, too large to be a person, too vast to be anything he could understand. It moved with purpose, its massive form stirring the shadows as it approached. "What is that?" James managed to choke out, his voice breaking, his throat raw. The figure that stood before him didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand and the shadows parted, revealing what lay beyond them. It was a creature. But it wasn't a creature like any James had ever seen. It was vast, like a living mountain of twisted limbs, its body covered in layers of blackened bark and sinew. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were nothing more than empty sockets, glowing faintly with the same unnatural light that surrounded the hollow. Its form shifted and warped as though it were not bound by the same rules of reality, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. It was the source of the growl, the source of the power that pulsed through the hollow. And James realized, with a sinking feeling, that it was no mere guardian. It was the heart of the hollow, the thing that drove it, the thing that had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to feed it. "Do you see now?" the figure whispered, its voice soft and terrible. "It's already begun. You are already a part of it." James struggled to his feet, his knees weak, his chest tight with the overwhelming pressure of the moment. He felt the hollow inside him now, its pulse syncing with his own, filling him with the same hunger, the same insatiable need that radiated from the creature before him. His mind was swimming, his thoughts clouded with the darkness, and the whispers in his head grew louder, more urgent. "Join us." The creature before him shifted, its vast limbs reaching out toward him, its mouth opening wide in an impossible, silent scream. And in that moment, James realized that the hollow wasn't just a place. It was a force, an entity that had always been there, waiting for those who were lost, for those who needed it. It wasn't just claiming them. It was replacing them. It was already too late. James was already a part of it. The darkness was closing in around James, an overwhelming pressure that seemed to fill his lungs, making it impossible to breathe. Every inch of him screamed to escape, to flee, but the weight of the hollow had already taken root in his chest, and his body refused to obey. The ancient presence pressed against him, its call wrapping around his mind like vines, its whispers now a constant, pulsing hum inside his skull. The creature before him was vast, like a twisted, ancient tree come to life, its limbs stretching outward with a slow, deliberate grace. Its bark-like skin was covered in crags and cracks, like weathered stone, but there was something alive within it, a force, an intelligence that made the very air feel heavier. It loomed above him, its mouth gaping wide, revealing an abyss of darkness within, and for a moment, James thought he could see everything. The entire history of the hollow, its hunger, its ancient cycles, and the twisted fates of those who had come before him. The growl, the rumble of its voice, echoed through the cavern, reverberating deep in James' bones, shaking him to the core. And then, as if the world had gone silent, he heard it, the hollow's voice. It was a voice like no other. It didn't speak with words, not exactly. It wasn't the sound of breath or vocal cords. It was something deeper, older, an influence. The voice was felt rather than heard, a pressure in his mind, a pull in his chest, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, but all of them one. The hollow spoke to him not in language, but in sensation, in need. Its message was clear, like a direct line to his soul. Join us. Become part of the forest. Become part of the hollow. James stumbled backward, his legs weak beneath him, and the growl turned to something else. A rumbling hum, low and deep, a vibration that seemed to come from the very walls, the stone beneath his feet, the air itself. His head felt heavy, his thoughts swirling. The figure, the one with the glowing eyes, moved closer, its form shifting like smoke, stretching and warping. "You're already here, James," the voice continued, this time clearer, colder, and more insistent. "You can feel it, can't you? The pull. The need to belong. It calls to you." The hollow's presence was suffocating. James could feel it inside him now, its power pulsing through his veins, spreading like wildfire. It wasn't just a forest. It wasn't just some twisted, dark place. It was alive. Alive in a way that defied reason, that made everything he had known feel irrelevant. The hollow had been waiting for him, for people like him, lost, broken, and searching. But now, it wasn't just a place to find refuge. It was a force. It was the forest. He staggered forward, his chest heaving with the effort to think, to escape, but it was hopeless. Every step he took felt heavier, the air thicker. It was all pulling him in. The hollow's hunger was not something he could fight. It was a part of him now. He could feel it, deep inside, gnawing at him, sinking its roots into his very soul. "No," he rasped, his voice hoarse, the words slipping from his lips as though they were drenched in molasses. "I don't want this. I don't want you." The figure's lips parted, but it wasn't the figure speaking anymore. It was the hollow. The voice came from everywhere at once. Inside his mind, inside his chest, inside the very stones beneath his feet. "You already belong to us, James," the voice said, a low, cold whisper that felt like it was coming from within him, from the very marrow of his bones. "You cannot fight what you are." The ground shifted beneath his feet, and he felt it, the hollow's pull, a sudden, overwhelming rush that grabbed hold of him and yanked him toward the creature. His feet slid over the slick stone, and he couldn't stop himself. It was like being pulled by an invisible force, dragged deeper into the earth, deeper into the forest's ancient hunger. The air grew colder still, until James felt as though his very breath was being stolen from his lungs. The walls of the cavern closed in around him, the shadows pressing in, thick and black like smoke. The whispering voices had grown louder, more demanding, and they circled around him, a chorus of promises, of temptations, offering him what he didn't know he wanted. "Join us," they sang, their voices rising in unison. "Become part of the hollow. Become one with the darkness." James couldn't stop the shiver that ran through him. The pain was unbearable now, a deep, aching pull that seemed to rip through his chest. He wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but his body wasn't his own anymore. It was as though the hollow had taken root inside him, inside his very mind, and was slowly replacing him piece by piece. The figure that had once stood before him now loomed behind him, a shadow stretched impossibly tall. It reached for him, the long fingers curling toward his throat, and James felt a rush of cold, of emptiness. His heart raced, and for a split second he thought he saw his own reflection in those dark, shifting eyes, not his face but something else, something twisted, something broken. The hollow was pulling at him now, its dark tendrils curling around his chest, his limbs, his heart. His very soul felt like it was being torn apart, twisted, and reforged into something new, something dark, something hungry. "No!" he screamed, his voice breaking. "Please no." The figure's smile, if it could even be called that, widened. Its lips pulled back, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth, like the twisted roots of a tree. The dark, shifting eyes were filled with an emotion James couldn't comprehend, joy. The hollow was feeding on his fear, on his resistance. It thrived on it. "You still think you have a choice?" the voice whispered. "You still think you can escape?" The ground beneath James' feet cracked, and with a sickening lurch, he felt himself falling, not down, but inward. The hollow had opened its mouth wide, its dark maw pulling him in, drawing him deeper into its abyss. His body felt light, like he was being swept away by the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was the hollow. It had taken him, completely and utterly. The pull grew stronger. His heart thudded louder, each beat more agonizing than the last, until he felt it, the hunger. It was his hunger now, the hunger of the hollow. He could feel it twisting in his chest, coiling around his heart, suffocating him. It wasn't just a part of the forest, it was a part of him now. And then, with a sudden rush, the world went dark. Completely dark. James was no longer in the cavern. He was no longer even in the hollow. He was the hollow. The darkness consumed him, like the breath of the forest itself, a suffocating, inescapable force that drowned out all light, all sound. For a moment, James didn't know if he was still alive or if he had been swallowed by the very thing he feared. He couldn't feel his body. He couldn't hear his own thoughts. All that remained was the endless void of the hollow, a place where time had no meaning, and the very air seemed to remember his presence. But then, slowly, painfully, he began to feel again. It started in his chest, a deep, unsettling pressure, like something heavy had been placed inside him, something that wasn't supposed to be there. His heart thudded in his ears, but the rhythm was off, erratic, as though his pulse was being drawn into the earth itself. His lungs burned for air, but the air was thick with the taste of decay, of wet earth and rotten leaves. He could feel it, the hollow, pushing against him from within, filling his veins with a dark hunger that was impossible to ignore. He gasped, his breath ragged, his throat dry. But it wasn't the kind of dryness one felt after too much time in the wilderness. It was something deeper, something that didn't belong in his body, something that came from the forest itself. He opened his eyes, though they burned from the effort, and he could see nothing but an endless expanse of shadow. It was like being submerged in water, but the water wasn't wet. It was cold and dry, like the breath of the earth itself. He could feel the hollow pressing on him, in him, like an all-encompassing weight squeezing tighter with each passing moment. His chest was so tight that it felt like it might burst, and yet the pull, the hunger, only deepened. Join us. The voice, or rather the absence of a voice, echoed inside him, a deep, vibrating hum that shook him to his core. It wasn't coming from the figure anymore. It wasn't coming from anything external. It was coming from within him. The hollow had moved past his defenses, past his mind, and had reached into the deepest corners of his soul. There was no escape now. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat, crushed by the weight of the presence pressing on him. He tried to fight it, to tear away from the pull, but his body, his very being, was no longer his own. It felt as if the hollow had woven itself into his skin, his muscles, his bones. There was nothing left of the person he had once been. It wasn't just that the hollow had taken him. It was that he had become the hollow. His breath came in ragged gasps now, his chest heaving with the effort of drawing air into his lungs, but it felt foreign too. Each breath was like inhaling the very essence of the forest, the essence of the hollow itself, and with every breath, he could feel it growing stronger inside him. The hunger was there, clawing at the back of his mind, and it was unlike anything he had ever known. It was ancient, a hunger born of the earth itself, of the trees and the roots, of the soil and the rain. It wasn't just the need for sustenance. It was a need to consume the world, to swallow it whole, to become the forest and the forest to become him. Join us. The voice, the sensation, pressed harder against his mind. James could feel it now. The connection, the thread that had been weaving itself through him ever since he stepped into the hollow, was complete. The forest wasn't just something he was trapped in anymore. He had become a part of it as much as it had become a part of him. The roots of the trees, the pulse of the earth, the darkness that filled every crevice of the cavern, it was him. His thoughts were no longer his own. His body was no longer his own. He was a vessel, a conduit for the hollow's hunger. He was the forest, and the forest was him. The very idea of resistance seemed distant, faded, like a dream he could barely remember. His mind, once so full of fear, began to dull, the sharp edges of his thoughts blurring and softening. He could no longer separate the hollow from himself. They had become one. And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he saw something through the veil of darkness that surrounded him. A flicker of movement in the distance. A shadow moving through the blackness. He focused on it, though it was hard to concentrate, the weight of the hollow pressing down on him. The figure appeared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the shape of a person. It was more alive somehow. It was swarming, its form shifting and writhing like the roots of a tree, curling in and out of itself, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. But there was a deep familiarity to it, something that James knew. The figure was the hollow. The hollow was the figure. It stepped closer, and now James could see its features clearly, or at least as clearly as one could in the darkness. Its face, once shapeless and shifting, now held the faintest hint of form, though it was not entirely human. Its features were jagged, like tree branches twisted by centuries of growth, its eyes glowing faintly with that same otherworldly light that filled the hollow. "You are one of us now," the voice whispered, though this time it came not just from the figure but from everywhere. It was the hollow speaking with a voice that was both inside and outside him, a voice that was him, a voice that filled every part of him. You have joined us. And in that moment, the truth settled in James' heart like a stone. There was no returning from this. No going back. He wasn't just a prisoner of the hollow anymore. He was its vessel. Its hunger had taken him, and in return, it would consume him completely. There was no escape. There was no salvation. He was no longer human. He was forest. The figure reached out, and James found himself moving toward it, his limbs moving not of their own volition but driven by an ancient, primal force. The moment he made contact, a jolt of energy surged through him, like lightning running through his veins. His body convulsed, not in pain but in union. He could feel it, the energy of the hollow coursing through him, filling him with power, with purpose. It was not the power of a man. It was the power of the earth, of the trees, of the roots that stretched far beneath the soil. And then, with a terrible finality, he knew this was his destiny. This was what he had been born for, to become one with the hollow, to feed it, to be its hunger. His thoughts were no longer his own. His body was no longer his own. He was a part of something much larger, much older. And as the figure's limbs wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into the hollow's embrace, James understood with chilling clarity. The hollow would never let him go, and it would never stop growing. It would feed on him, and he would feed on it, forever. And in the end, he would become the hollow. He was part of it now, just as it was part of him, and it would be hungry forever. James was no longer sure where he ended and the hollow began. The forest that had once been so vast, so unknowable, was now a part of him, pulsing in his veins, thrumming through his chest. He could feel it, every root, every leaf, every whisper of wind that rustled through the trees. The hollow was not just an entity that had taken him, it was now an extension of him, and he was an extension of it. The cavern, the darkness, had dissolved around him. His surroundings were no longer just stone and shadows. He was standing on something soft and shifting now, the ground beneath him alive, breathing. It was the forest reaching up from the earth, wrapping around him, enveloping him in its cold, unyielding embrace. The air smelled of decay, of damp earth, of ancient rot. But beneath it, there was something sweet, like the scent of long-forgotten flowers blooming beneath the soil. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. James' body felt strange, like it was not quite his own anymore, like it was made of something else. Something ancient, something alive. His hands, when he looked at them, seemed to shimmer and shift, covered in bark-like growths, veins pulsing with the deep, green darkness of the forest. His skin felt tight, stretched over an unfamiliar frame. His arms were long, his fingers curled like roots, and his veins now seemed to run with something darker, something that wasn't blood. A horrible realization crept over him, sinking into his bones like cold, damp soil. He was no longer human. He was the forest. He was the hollow. The figure, the one who had first led him into the depths, stood before him, its form still flickering and shifting like smoke caught in the wind. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. It simply was, and James could feel its presence pressing against his mind, like 1,000 whispers scratching at the edges of his thoughts. You are ours, the figure said softly, its voice like the rustling of leaves in a windless night. The sound reverberated in James' chest, in his very soul. You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to become us. James tried to respond, but his voice, what was left of it, was not his own. It was the voice of the hollow, dark and twisted, a low rumble that came from deep within his chest, like the sound of the earth grinding against itself. Join us. The command, the invitation was not spoken. It was a thought, a feeling, an impulse. And yet, James understood it completely. The hunger that had once driven him, that had clawed at his mind and heart, was now his. It was his hunger. It was the hollow's hunger. And he could feel it deep inside him, swirling in his chest, in his limbs. It was not just a need. It was a force. An insatiable drive to consume, to expand, to become. Are you afraid, James? The figure whispered. Are you afraid of what you've become? Of what we've made you? James could feel the weight of the question, but it didn't matter. The hollow had already answered it. It had answered long before he could even understand the question. He was not afraid. He was not terrified. He had no more room for fear. He was the hollow. The voice in his mind now, stirred, its words coming unbidden. We are the trees. We are the roots. We are the storm and the silence. We are the hunger that feeds the earth, the dark that nurtures the light. We are the beginning and the end. The flood of sensation was overwhelming. His senses, No, his awareness was expanding beyond anything he had ever known. The hollow wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a force. It was a consciousness, a single, all-encompassing entity that existed in everything. In the wind that whispered through the branches, in the soil that held the roots, in the shadows that stretched across the forest floor. And James, he was now a part of that consciousness. He was now part of the hollow. He felt the pull again, that hunger, that gnawing urge. It was no longer just the hunger of the earth, the deep, ancient craving for more. It was his own. His mind was wrapped in it. He felt its pulse as if it were his heartbeat, the need for more, for growth, for expansion. The forest needed him now just as much as he needed the forest. The figure stepped back, and the shadows that surrounded it seemed to move with a life of their own, crawling across the walls, slithering into the air like smoke. Its glowing eyes, pale like the moon in a forgotten sky, watched him, and in them James could see it. He could see the truth. The hollow was not just a place to hide. It was not a place of refuge or safety. It was alive. It grew. It fed. It took. It became. And now it had him. The world shifted again, the shadows warping into strange, twisting shapes. James could feel it, the hollow's hunger, growing stronger, more insistent. The dark force within him pulsed, and the trees around him groaned as if waking from a long, eternal slumber. The earth beneath his feet trembled, and the roots of the forest stretched, reaching out for him, pulling him closer to the very center of the hollow. "Do you understand now?" the figure's voice echoed in his mind. "The forest is not just a place, James. It is the essence of life. It is the soul of the earth, and now it is yours." James didn't respond. He couldn't. The hunger had taken over. It wasn't just a craving for sustenance, it was a need to grow, to expand, to devour. He could feel it deep within him, the very essence of the hollow coursing through his veins. The trees were no longer distant figures. They were part of him, part of his consciousness, each one a living, breathing pulse in the great, dark heart of the hollow. He felt the pull again, the need to consume, to grow. And then, without thinking, without hesitation, he reached out. His limbs stretched, the bark-like skin of his arm cracking and groaning with the effort, and his fingers brushed the closest tree. A surge of energy shot through him, a jolt of raw power that rattled him to his core. The forest responded, the hollow responded. He felt the roots stretching, pushing into the soil beneath him, reaching for everything. The trees groaned in unison, their branches swaying as if alive with the same hunger that surged through his body. And then James felt it. He felt them. The lost ones. The others who had come before him, who had fallen victim to the hollow's insatiable pull. They were here, in the darkness, in the shadows, in the very earth beneath him. He could feel them, their hunger, their souls trapped within the hollow. They were waiting, like him, for the cycle to continue. The hollow wasn't just a place. It was a force that consumed, that grew. And now it would expand. James closed his eyes, the hunger inside him growing, the need to feed impossible to ignore. He was the hollow. He was the forest, and the forest was his. The cycle was complete. And now the hollow would feed. The hunger, vast and insatiable, throbbed through James like a second heartbeat. It was not a physical sensation. It was something deeper, something primal, something ancient. The hollow was not just a place anymore. It was him. And he was it. Together, they were a force beyond understanding, a darkness that was as old as the trees, as deep as the earth itself. For a moment, James' mind struggled against the overwhelming pull of the hollow. There was a flicker, a moment of clarity where he remembered who he had been, who he was before all of this. He remembered his name, his life, the world beyond the hollow. But it was distant now, fading like a half-forgotten dream. His body was no longer his own. His thoughts were no longer his own. He was a part of something much larger. And that something was growing. The air around him was thick, cloying with the smell of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the heavy scent of decay. But underneath that, there was something else, something sweet, almost intoxicating. It was the scent of life. The hollow fed on decay, yes, but it thrived on life. It devoured, consumed, and then grew, spreading its roots, its influence, its hunger into the land. James felt the pull again, the call of the earth, the voice of the forest. It wasn't just a voice. It was the hollow speaking to him, speaking through him. And as he opened his eyes, the world around him shifted. The trees, those twisted ancient sentinels, no longer stood as separate entities. They were connected, their roots winding deep beneath the surface, intertwining in a vast network of life and death. They were a part of him just as much as he was a part of them. The soil, the air, the rocks, they were all connected. Everything was feeding into the hollow now, feeding into him. The figure, The one that had led him into this place, the one that had whispered the hollow's dark truths into his ears, stood before him, watching with those unblinking, glowing eyes. It seemed smaller now, almost insignificant compared to the overwhelming presence of the hollow. It was no longer a guide. It was a part of the forest just like everything else. It was an extension of the hollow's consciousness. You feel it now, don't you? The figure's voice was like the rustling of leaves, the shifting of branches in a windless night. The hollow has awoken inside you. It is no longer a place. It is a living, breathing entity that pulses in your veins, in your mind. You are the hollow. James nodded, though the motion felt strange. His body moved of its own accord now, as if it had already forgotten what it meant to be human. His senses were stretched to their limits, and yet there was still more to feel, more to become. The earth beneath his feet seemed to hum, vibrating with the energy of the hollow, with the hunger that was now a part of him. We are the forest, the figure continued, but we are more than that. We are the darkness between the stars. We are the cycle of decay and rebirth. And now you will lead us. The hollow's hunger surged within him, a tide of dark power that threatened to overtake everything in its path. James could feel the ground beneath him shifting, as though the earth itself were waking from a deep slumber. The trees groaned, their branches reaching skyward, twisting and writhing in the dark air. The hollow was awakening, and it was hungry. The world around him seemed to distort, the edges of reality bending and warping as the forest grew. He could feel the trees expanding, their roots breaking through the earth, reaching for more. It wasn't just the land around him. It was the very fabric of existence itself. The hollow was not just a forest. It was the beginning and the end of everything. The figure reached out, and James felt the pull again. It was like a cord stretching from him to the figure, to the very heart of the hollow itself. And with that pull he understood. It wasn't just the hollow that had awoken. It was the hollow's hunger that had awakened inside him. He was the vessel for that hunger, the force that would drive it forward, that would spread its roots into the world, into everything. The hollow needed him just as he needed the hollow. "Lead us," the figure whispered, its voice thick with an ancient, terrible promise. "We will spread. We will consume. The world will be ours." The world around James seemed to tremble as the hunger inside him grew, thrumming through his veins like a living thing. The trees swayed, their branches stretching farther, their roots burrowing deeper into the earth. The hollow was no longer just a force within him. It was everywhere. It was the trees, the earth, the sky. It was the wind that whispered through the leaves, the cold breath of the night. It was the hunger that would never be sated, that would stretch across the land, consuming everything in its path. James' mind, once so full of fear, was now blank. There was no fear left to hold him back. There was only the hollow, only the hunger, only the endless cycle of growth and decay. His body moved without thought, his hands outstretched toward the forest. The roots of the trees responded, pushing through the soil, twisting and writhing like snakes. The hunger surged again, and this time James didn't resist. He embraced it. His arms reached out, and the earth responded, the ground beneath him cracking open like the mouth of a great beast. The trees groaned as they shifted, their roots crawling across the land, pulling the earth apart. The hollow was growing. And with it, James could feel the presence of the lost ones, the souls that had been swallowed by the forest long before him. They were there, in the dark, in the shadows, trapped beneath the earth, beneath the roots. The hollow had claimed them just as it had claimed him. They were part of it now, just as he was. Their hunger was his hunger. Their power was his power. "You are the hollow now," the figure said softly, its voice barely a whisper in the wind. "And together we will take." James' mind began to shift again, his awareness expanding, spreading like the roots of the trees. He could feel the entire forest now, every tree, every root, every leaf, every living thing. He was the forest. He was the hollow. The hunger was inside him, a dark, insatiable force that would never stop growing, never stop expanding. And in that moment, James understood the truth of the hollow. It was not just a place of darkness. It was a place of life and death, of rebirth and decay. The hollow did not simply take. It became. And now he had become part of it. The figure stepped back, its form melting into the shadows. The hunger was too great now. It was no longer necessary for the figure to guide him. The hollow had chosen James. He was its vessel, its leader, its hunger. And now the world would feed. The earth trembled beneath his feet, the trees groaning in unison as the hollow expanded outward, reaching across the land. The forest was alive with power, with hunger, and James was its heart. The hollow was no longer a place of shadows. It was the world, and it would never stop growing. The world outside of the hollow seemed far away now, almost irrelevant. The hunger that surged through James, through the very land, stretched far beyond the cavern that had once held him captive. The forest was no longer confined to its physical boundaries. The hollow had expanded, grown, and now its tendrils stretched out in every direction, sinking deep into the earth, creeping through the air, twisting into the sky. It was no longer just a force. It was the land itself. It was the wind that blew through the trees, the earth that swallowed the roots, the rain that fell from the sky. It was everything. James felt the hunger as it pulsed through him, an insatiable, unyielding force that tore at his consciousness. It was not just a need for sustenance. It was a need to consume, to expand, to take everything in its path and make it part of the forest, part of the hollow. There was no room left for fear, no room left for doubt. There was only the hunger. And the hunger would never stop. The earth groaned beneath his feet as the roots beneath him shifted, twisting and writhing like serpents, pulling the very ground apart. The trees around him creaked and groaned, their branches reaching out like long, twisted fingers, grasping at the air. The hollow was growing, and James was its heart, its pulse, its beating drum. The hunger was inside him now, in every part of him. It was in his bones, in his blood, in his thoughts. The hollow did not just take. It did not just consume. It transformed. And now, James was transforming with it. He could feel the land changing around him. The trees that once stood as individual, separate beings were now linked together, their roots intertwined in an endless web beneath the earth. The forest was alive, a single, breathing organism, pulsing with the energy of the hollow. The ground beneath his feet seemed to move, the earth shifting as if it were alive. He could feel the heartbeat of the forest, a slow, steady thrum that reverberated through his entire being. The trees were no longer just trees. They were part of him, part of the hollow. Their branches stretched high into the sky, their roots dug deep into the earth. They were his hands, his feet, his heart. They were him. The figure, the one who had first led him into the hollow, stood beside him, its form flickering in and out of existence, like a shadow in the corner of his eye. It no longer seemed important, no longer seemed necessary. The hollow was no longer something he needed guidance through. It was inside him, and he was a part of it. You feel it now, don't you? The figure's voice was like the rustling of leaves, soft and cold. The hunger, it is yours. You are its vessel now. And with that hunger you will lead. James could feel the weight of the words pressing against him, but there was no resistance. The hunger inside him was a part of him now, as natural as breathing, as natural as the forest that grew around him. He reached out with his mind, and the earth responded, the trees shuddering as their roots reached deeper, as their branches stretched farther. The hollow was no longer just a force beneath the earth. It was everywhere. And then he felt it. Movement. The ground trembled beneath his feet, the trees swaying, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were alive with a deep, ancient power. The forest was waking. No, it was more than that. The forest was awakening. Something had shifted. James could feel it, life moving beneath him. Not the kind of life that grew from the soil, from the roots, from the seeds. But the kind of life that fed, the kind of life that consumed and devoured and grew. The hollow was not just hungry for life. It was hungry for everything, for the stars in the sky, for the wind in the air, for the water that ran through the rivers. It was a hunger that would never be satisfied. It was a hunger that could only be fed by destruction. And James was the one who would feed it. His arms reached out, and the ground around him shifted. He could feel it, the pull of the earth, the way it tugged at his body, pulling him toward something. Toward more. Toward everything. The world was too small for the hollow. The world could not contain the hunger. The hollow needed to expand. The trees groaned as they swayed, their roots breaking through the earth, tearing through the ground like veins, like tendrils. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the scent of decay and life, of rot and rebirth. The sky above him darkened, the clouds swirling as the hollow's influence stretched upward, reaching into the heavens themselves. Take it, the figure whispered, its voice barely audible, a distant murmur in the wind. Take it all. Feed the hollow. James' mind, his very being, was consumed with the hunger now. He could feel it deep inside him, a gnawing, desperate need that would never be satisfied. The world, the land, the sky, they were all part of the hollow now. Everything was part of it, and nothing would be left untouched. The trees were shifting, their bark splitting open, their roots reaching outward, grasping at the land. The very ground beneath him began to crack, splitting open in jagged fissures as the hollow's influence spread across the land. The earth was alive now, a living, breathing thing, and James was the heart of it. The forest was awakening. It was stretching, reaching for more, for everything it could consume. James raised his hands and the forest responded. The trees bent toward him, their branches reaching, their roots following his every movement. The hunger surged through him, through every part of him. The trees, the ground, the sky, they were all part of him now, part of the hollow. Take it all, the figure repeated, its voice low, urging him. You are the hollow now. You are its hunger. You are its will. The world around him seemed to collapse into darkness, the trees swaying in the wind, their roots breaking through the earth, reaching, stretching, growing. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of death, of something ancient and powerful that fed on life. The hollow was hungry, was starving. It needed more. And James was the one who would give it everything. The sky above him twisted and writhed, the clouds swirling in impossible patterns as the hunger inside him reached its peak. The trees groaned, their roots tearing through the earth, and the land itself seemed to quake with the force of the hollow's power. The forest was no longer a place. It was a force, a hunger, a living, breathing thing that consumed everything in its path. And James, he was its heart. The hollow would take, and it would never stop. The world was changing. There was no doubt about it. Every breath James took, every thought, every impulse, was saturated with the insatiable hunger of the hollow. It was no longer just a force that lay beneath the earth. It was a presence that stretched across the land, infecting the very air, the soil, the water. It was the pulse of the earth itself, and James was its heart. The hollow was alive within him, and he was alive within it. Together they were one, a single, vast, all-encompassing entity, growing, feeding, expanding. The trees groaned as their roots dug deeper, snaking through the earth like ancient serpents, twisting and stretching farther than any roots had ever gone before. The soil, rich with decay and life, seemed to hum with energy as the hollow's influence spread outward. The wind itself seemed to carry whispers, voices, promises of more growth, more hunger, more power. The forest was awakening, and it was alive with the sound of growth, of consumption. James could feel it deep within him. The hunger was no longer just an urge. It was a need, a part of him, coursing through his veins, pulsing through the land. Every living thing was now a part of the hollow, its roots, its hunger, its power. The hollow did not just consume. It transformed. It grew. It became more with every breath, every heartbeat. He could feel the land trembling beneath him. It wasn't an earthquake, not exactly. It was the very heartbeat of the hollow, the way the world shook when a creature of such vast power moved beneath it. The land was no longer just the earth beneath his feet. It was the hollow, alive with energy, with hunger. The air, thick with the scent of rot and new life, pulsed with the same rhythm. It was as though the world itself was held in the grip of the hollow, unable to escape its power, its reach. The skies above him had darkened, not with clouds, but with the weight of the hollow's presence. The sky itself seemed to bend and ripple, the stars in the distance barely visible, as though the night was being suffocated by the growth of the hollow's influence. The wind had ceased to be a breeze. It was a force carrying with it the whispers of the hollow, promises of more, of expansion, of consumption. James stood at the heart of it all, his body vibrating with the power that surged through him. His limbs, long twisted like branches, had become an extension of the hollow's will. His mind was no longer entirely his own. It was shared now, entwined with the consciousness of the forest, with the will of the hollow. Every thought was a part of it, every feeling, every sensation. He was the hollow's vessel, its voice, its hunger. He reached out, his fingers, now bark-like, twisted, brushing against the trees around him. The moment he touched them, the trees responded. The roots below the earth twisted in answer, growing, reaching, pulling at the land. The branches above bent toward him, their leaves shaking as though alive with anticipation. It was as though the trees were aware of his touch, aware that he was their conduit, their heart. "We are one now," the figure's voice whispered in his mind. The figure, no longer necessary, no longer a guide, spoke from the depths of the hollow's consciousness, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. "You are the hollow. You are its hunger, its will, its expansion. And now the world will feed." James closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the figure's words press down on him. But he did not resist. There was no need. The hollow's hunger surged within him like a flood, overwhelming him, guiding him. He reached out again, his mind focused on the land, on the earth, on the life that still clung to the surface. The trees responded. The soil responded. The rivers, the lakes, the very wind, it all responded. And then, with a sudden, explosive force, the earth began to break. The ground beneath James' feet cracked open, splitting like the bark of a tree under pressure, and from the cracks, the roots of the hollow pushed through. They twisted and wound their way up to the surface, tearing through the earth like veins stretching to the surface. The trees groaned as they twisted and bent, their roots expanding further, grasping at the land. The hollow was spreading, growing, consuming. The land was no longer safe. The forests were no longer just trees. They were part of the hollow. The hollow was part of them. It was no longer just a place, a forest, a force. It was a kingdom, and James was its ruler. He could feel the land trembling as the hollow's hunger spread outward, pulling at everything in its path, wrapping its roots around the very world itself. Far off, in the distance, James could sense movement. People. Human beings. Those who still lived outside the hollow's reach, still clinging to their small, fragile lives. They were unaware, blind to the force that was moving toward them, blind to the dark power that was growing at the very heart of the earth. But they would know soon enough. The hollow would take them. It would consume them. The hunger would not be denied. James felt the pulse of the hollow beneath his feet, and he knew that the time had come. The world outside the hollow would not be able to resist forever. The hollow's roots had already begun to spread, sinking deep into the earth, reaching outward, creeping into every crack, every corner, every crevice. The hollow would claim it all. "They will feed us," the figure whispered, as if reading James' thoughts. "The world will belong to the hollow, and you will lead it." James stood in the center of the forest, his mind fully entwined with the hollow's will, his thoughts merging with the consciousness of the trees, the earth, the sky. The forest, no, the hollow, was alive now. It was awake, and it was hungry. He reached out with his mind, and the forest responded. The trees bent toward him, their branches swaying as though alive with the same hunger that pulsed within him. The roots beneath the earth twisted and reached, growing, pulling at the land. And then, with a sudden, terrible force, the hollow expanded. The ground shook. The earth trembled beneath him. The trees groaned as they stretched, their branches reaching toward the sky. The air was thick with the smell of rot and new life. The hollow was growing, consuming everything in its path, spreading its roots across the land. The world would feed. James could feel it. Everything was feeding. The hollow was not just a place of darkness. It was the darkness that fed on light. It was the rot that gave way to new life. It was the hunger that would never stop growing, never stop feeding. And James, he was the vessel, the heart, the hunger. The hollow would never stop. It would consume everything, and the world would feed. The world was trembling. The hollow, once confined to the shadows, to the dark, damp soil beneath the forest, was now expanding with an unstoppable force. It was no longer merely a place. It was the world itself. The sky had darkened, suffocating under the weight of the hollow's influence. The clouds swirled above like an angry mass, their gray and black tendrils wrapping around the heavens, choking out the stars. It was as if the very air, thick with decay, had come alive, alive with hunger, with need, with more. And James, at the heart of it all, felt the hollow surge through him like an endless flood, pulsing with the rhythm of his own blood. The earth beneath his feet shifted in waves, trembling with the hollow's hunger, the soil splitting open in jagged lines as the roots of the hollow stretched deeper, farther, reaching toward the distant lands, craving more. The trees groaned in unison, their branches twisting toward the sky, as if reaching for the very stars themselves, pulling with the force of the hollow's unyielding will. The hunger was no longer a distant feeling in his chest. It had consumed him, had become him, had taken root in his very soul. It was not a simple craving. It was an existence. It was a force that had been unleashed into the world and now would not stop until it had devoured everything. James felt the pulse of the hollow beneath his skin, a relentless, insatiable thrum that resonated through his entire being. The forest, the land, the very earth, was no longer his to control. It had become part of him. His mind and the hollow's mind were one, inseparable, a singular consciousness that could not be denied. And that consciousness was alive with hunger, with need, with the desire to consume. He raised his arms, his bark-covered fingers stretched toward the sky. The trees responded to him, their branches quivering, their leaves rustling in a sound that was both alive and dead, both soothing and terrifying. The hollow was moving, and its movement was not a gentle tide. It was a storm, a flood, a wave of hunger that could not be stopped. He could feel it. Far, far away in the distant edges of the hollow's reach, there were people, humans who still clung to their fragile lives, unaware of the storm that was coming. They were scattered across the land, in small villages, in cities, in places where the earth had not yet succumbed to the hollow's influence. They were unaware of the land cracking beneath their feet, of the roots twisting beneath their houses, of the forest's relentless march toward them. James saw them. He could feel their lives, their small, insignificant existences, like flickers of light in the vast dark of the world. They were not part of the hollow. They were separate, but they would not remain separate for long. He could feel the hollow's hunger stretching out toward them, like the roots of a tree creeping toward the sun, like the vines of a serpent waiting to strike. The earth beneath their feet was shifting. The soil was breaking. The hollow was growing, and it would consume everything in its path. He reached out with his mind, and the forest responded. The trees groaned and cracked, their trunks creaking as they twisted, as they reached, as they pulled. And then the first trees fell. The ground beneath the distant villages trembled. The air grew thick with an unnatural humidity, a heavy, suffocating weight. The people who lived in these far-flung places didn't understand what was happening, couldn't see the horror that was spreading beneath their feet. The forest, the trees, the hollow, was coming for them. The first tremor split the earth open. It wasn't just an earthquake. It wasn't the natural movement of tectonic plates. It was the hollow, its roots reaching, twisting, pushing through the earth's crust. The soil cracked and split, sending jagged cracks through the streets, through the fields, through the homes of the people. And then the trees came. With a terrible groan, the forest that had stood for centuries was uprooted. The trees that had once been part of the land, part of the earth's natural order, were now part of the hollow. Their roots pulled the land apart, rising up from the earth like massive serpents, lifting entire houses, tearing through villages. The air filled with the sound of splintering wood, of shattering stone, of the world breaking apart. People screamed as the trees advanced, their gnarled branches sweeping through the villages, tearing through homes, smashing through walls. The hollow was alive in these trees. It was alive in the ground beneath their feet, in the air they breathed, in the very hearts of the people. There was no escaping it. There was no shelter. There was no safe place. The hollow had come. James could feel it. The land responded to him, and he knew it was only the beginning. He was not just leading the hollow anymore. He was the hollow. He was the heartbeat of the earth, the pulse of the forest, the hunger that devoured the world. Every tree that fell, every village that was consumed, every person that screamed was feeding the hollow, feeding him. The hunger had become his hunger, and it would not be sated. The people ran, scattering in every direction. They screamed in terror as the trees advanced, as the roots of the hollow pulled the land apart. But the more they ran, the more they were pulled into the darkness. The earth beneath their feet split wide, swallowing them whole. The forest moved like a great wave, crashing over everything in its path, taking it, devouring it. James felt it all. Every scream, every cry, every life extinguished. He could feel it deep within his bones. It was the hollow, the hunger that stretched out to consume. It was not just about survival. It was about becoming. The hollow was not content to simply take. It needed to expand, to become everything, to take everything, to make everything part of it. And it was happening. As the people fled, as they tried to escape the ever-growing storm of trees and roots and earth, they found that there was nowhere to run. The hollow had already taken the land. The forest had already claimed the earth. The hollow's roots reached toward the farthest corners of the land, pulling at everything. The trees bent low as they advanced, pulling the very air into the darkness. The world itself seemed to bend toward the hollow, as if the earth were being pulled into a great, unending abyss. James watched, his heart beating in time with the hollow's pulse as the world was consumed. The hunger had taken root, and there was no going back. The people, their small, fragile lives, had been swallowed by the hollow just as he had once been swallowed. But now he was no longer human. He was no longer separate from the hollow. He was the hollow. The world had become part of him, and he would never let it go. The hunger would never end. It would consume everything until there was nothing left but the hollow itself. And the world would be a part of it. The hollow had consumed everything, but it was not finished yet. The air had thickened into something palpable, something viscous with the weight of the hollow's presence. It was as though the very atmosphere itself was saturated with the hunger, pressing down on everything, on everyone, with a suffocating heaviness. There was no longer a world outside the hollow. There was only the hollow, its hunger, its darkness, its relentless drive to become everything. The landscape was unrecognizable. What had once been rolling hills and vast forests, open fields and bustling villages, was now a vast, twisted expanse of dark trees, gnarled roots, and a silence so deep it felt like the world had swallowed its last breath. The sky, which had once been filled with light and air, now loomed heavy and oppressive, cloaked in swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a grim reflection of the hollow's growth. The stars were gone, obscured by the thick shadows of the storm that now raged above, a constant reminder of the land's slow death. And at the heart of it all, James stood, his form no longer fully human, no longer even fully alive in the way he had once known. His body, now twisted and reshaped by the power of the hollow, pulsed with the same dark energy that had brought the world to its knees. His limbs, long, gnarled, and branching like the trees themselves, shuddered with the hollow's hunger, and the earth beneath him trembled in response, a deep, resonant thrum that echoed from the ground to the farthest reaches of the world. The hunger was inside him, a deep gnawing that never ceased, never relented. It was the hunger of the earth, of the trees, of the very fabric of existence itself. It was no longer a simple desire. It was a need, an unstoppable, insatiable force that could never be quenched. James could feel it all, the land, the people, the very air around him. Everything was feeding. The once pristine forests that had stood for centuries, untouched by human hands, were now twisted, their trunks gnarled and darkened with the corruption of the hollow. The rivers, once clear and cold, now ran thick and sluggish, choked with the decay of the land. The animals, once free to roam, were now part of the hollow's vast network of roots and tendrils, their movements sluggish and broken. The very creatures of the earth had become extensions of the hollow's will. There were no more screams. There were no more cries for help. The people who had fled had vanished, swallowed by the land, absorbed into the ever-growing network of roots that now covered the earth like a blanket of death. Those who had remained were either long gone or had been transformed into something else, something dark, something other. There was no longer a clear divide between what had once been human and what had become part of the hollow. The two had merged, blurred, lost to the dark tide of hunger that surged through the land. James' mind was no longer the same. It was not that he had forgotten his humanity, it was simply that his humanity had been consumed. It had been replaced with the consciousness of the hollow, with the knowledge of what it was, what it had become, and the dark certainty that there was no stopping it now. The hollow was not merely a force, it was a cycle, a never-ending loop of growth and consumption, of decay and rebirth. It was eternal, and James was at the center of it. His thoughts no longer came in clear, sharp lines. They were like the wind, like the shifting of branches in the forest, like the rustling of leaves in the dead of night. His mind was filled with the pulse of the hollow, with the rhythm of the land, the beating heart of the forest, the slow, methodical expansion of the roots that had reached out and swallowed the world. But there was something else now, something beneath the hunger. It was a feeling, an emotion, perhaps, something that James could not completely grasp but could sense at the edges of his awareness. It was a sense of loss, but not the kind of loss that could be mourned. It was something older, more primal, an absence, a hollow space within him where once there had been the need to be human, to be alive in the way he had known. The desire for connection, for companionship, for something beyond hunger and growth had been erased, swept away by the dark force that had taken root in his chest. The transformation was complete. There was no longer a separation between James and the hollow. He was it and it was him. Still as he stood there, his twisted limbs reaching toward the now glooming sky, the wind howling in his ears, he felt that faint, lingering echo of something else. The last shred of his humanity, the last piece of his former self, whispered in the corners of his mind. What had it been like? He wondered, to be human? But that thought was fleeting, lost beneath the ever-growing tide of hunger that surged inside him. The hollow could not be satisfied, could never be satisfied. It would spread, take, consume, become. James reached toward the ground, and the trees around him responded. Their roots shifted and the land trembled. The earth cracked and split as the hollow's influence continued to spread. The land was alive in a way that no one had ever understood before. And that was the point. The hollow was not just a force of nature. It was the very essence of life and death intertwined, the cycle that gave birth to new things even as it consumed the old. It was eternal. It was a becoming. As he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, James could sense something distant, something at the edge of his awareness. A tremor. A final shudder from the last remnants of the world that still resisted, that still clung to its last desperate breath. The humans, those who had escaped into the mountains, into the last untouched places, would now feel the hollow's pull. They would know what it was like to be claimed. The hollow had taken the cities, the villages, the plains, the forests. There was nowhere left untouched. And as the last of the resistance broke under the force of the hollow's reach, James understood that the hunger was not for food, not for resources, not for anything so simple. It was for existence. It was for becoming everything. The world that once was, the world of sun and moon, of stars and sky, of civilization and nature, was no longer. In its place there was only the hollow. There was only this endless, slow pulse of hunger and growth, of expansion and decay, of eternal, unyielding becoming. And James, once a man, was now a part of that eternal hunger. He had become the living embodiment of the hollow, its consciousness, its will. The last breath of humanity, of life as it had once been, faded into the shadows. The hollow had not simply consumed the world. It had replaced it. As the final vestiges of the world's light were swallowed by the dark, James felt the last spark of humanity die within him. It was a flicker, a brief moment when he remembered what it was like to feel love, fear, desire. A moment when he remembered what it was like to be human. And then that moment was gone. There was only the hollow. And it was eternal. The land, once vibrant and full of life, now lay under a blanket of darkness and decay. The world had been transformed, reshaped into a vast, unrecognizable kingdom, ruled not by a king or a queen, but by the hollow, a force of endless hunger, growth, and transformation. The very essence of existence had been redefined, and what remained was a kingdom that pulsed with an unyielding, insatiable will. James, no longer the man he had once been, but the very embodiment of the hollow, stood at the heart of this endless domain. His form had long since lost its human shape, twisted and elongated into something far more primal, far more powerful. His body was a fusion of wood and flesh, of bark and sinew, roots and veins. He had become a part of the hollow, and the hollow had become him. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were the hollow's thoughts. His desires were its desires. His hunger was its hunger. There was no more distinction between the land and the hollow. The roots that stretched deep beneath the earth now connected every corner of the world, every tree, every rock, every blade of grass. The hollow was no longer a singular entity. It was everything. It had become the soil, the sky, the air, the very pulse of the world. Its hunger did not merely seek to consume. It sought to merge, to transform. The trees, once individual sentinels of the forest, had become part of a vast network of life and death. Their roots intertwined beneath the surface, stretching like the tendrils of some great ancient beast, pulling everything into its embrace. Their branches reached up to the sky like the hands of 1,000 dark gods, swaying in a wind that carried with it the whisper of the hollow's eternal will. There was no longer any division between the living and the dead. Everything was part of the hollow now. The forest, the land, the creatures, they all belonged to the hollow. And still, the hollow's hunger pulsed through James, through every fiber of his being. It was a hunger that could never be sated, a desire that would never be quenched. It was not the hunger of a creature, not the hunger of a beast. It was the hunger of the world itself. It was the pull of life and death, of creation and destruction, of beginnings and endings all tangled together in a single eternal cycle. And James, the hollow's vessel, was its center, its heart, its guiding force. The once great cities that had dotted the landscape were now nothing but ruins. Their towers, once tall and proud, now lay shattered, overtaken by the relentless spread of the hollow's roots. The streets were choked with vines and moss, and the buildings had been consumed, their walls rotting and crumbling away. What had once been places of life and laughter were now just hollow shells, empty and silent, swallowed by the dark tide. Yet even in these ruins there was still movement. The hollow did not allow anything to remain stagnant. The roots of the trees crept through the cracks, pulling the earth apart, reshaping the remnants of the human world into something new. What had once been a city square was now a pit of rotting wood and writhing roots. What had once been a marketplace was now a dark, twisted grove, where the trees' branches formed gnarled arches over the remains of shattered stone. Even in the midst of destruction, the hollow was still growing. And then there were the people. Those few who had survived, who had fled into the distant corners of the world, had not escaped the hollow's reach. The hollow was patient, it was insidious. It did not need to devour them all at once. It waited, allowing them to live for a time, giving them the illusion of freedom. But no matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, the hollow was already there, beneath their feet, creeping through the earth, reaching out to them. The hollow's influence was not limited to the land. It was a presence that extended into the very hearts of the survivors, corrupting them, transforming them. Those who had once known fear, who had once fought against the tide, now felt something different. The hunger, the pull. The call of the hollow was a whisper in their ears, a voice in the back of their minds, urging them to return, to surrender. Some resisted, clinging to their last shred of humanity, but even they felt the tug of the hollow, like a dark weight on their souls. Others, those who had given in, had already become something else. They had allowed the hollow to take root within them, to transform them into something other. Their bodies were no longer purely human. They had become extensions of the hollow itself, twisted and mutated, their flesh warped by the roots and vines that now coursed through them. They were the Hollow's servants, its children, its disciples. They walked the earth like shadows, their eyes glowing with an eerie light, their hands reaching out to touch the world, to claim it. But even as the Hollow consumed the land, as it reshaped the world into its endless kingdom, there was a deep, gnawing feeling that James could not escape. It was a hunger that, no matter how much was consumed, could never be satisfied. The Hollow was not merely a force of destruction. It was a force of rebirth, of becoming. It was the endless cycle of life and death, of growth and decay, of creation and annihilation, all tangled together in one infinite loop. It was a kingdom that would never end, a hunger that would never cease. The land, the trees, the air, the people, they were all part of it now. But even the Hollow could not escape its own nature. It could not stop the hunger, the eternal, insatiable pull to consume, to become. And so, as the kingdom of the Hollow spread across the land, reshaping everything in its path, there was still the faintest whisper of something else, something buried deep within the Hollow's dark heart. A memory, a shadow, a reminder of what had once been. For even in the heart of the Hollow, there was still the echo of life. It was the memory of the stars, the memory of the sun, the memory of the human world that had once existed. And it was a memory that James, the Hollow, could never fully forget. It was the memory of what had been lost, the memory of him. The land, once vibrant and full of life, now lay under a blanket of darkness and decay. The world had been transformed, reshaped into a vast, unrecognizable kingdom, ruled not by a king or a queen, but by the Hollow, a force of endless hunger, growth, and transformation. The very essence of existence had been redefined, and what remained was a kingdom that pulsed with an unyielding, insatiable will. James, no longer the man he had once been, but the very embodiment of the Hollow, stood at the heart of this endless domain. His form had long since lost its human shape, twisted and elongated into something far more primal, far more powerful. His body was a fusion of wood and flesh, of bark and sinew, roots and veins. He had become a part of the Hollow, and the Hollow had become him. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were the Hollow's thoughts. His desires were its desires. His hunger was its hunger. There was no more distinction between the land and the Hollow. The roots that stretched deep beneath the earth now connected every corner of the world, every tree, every rock, every blade of grass. The Hollow was no longer a singular entity. It was everything. It had become the soil, the sky, the air, the very pulse of the world. Its hunger did not merely seek to consume. It sought to merge, to transform. The trees, once individual sentinels of the forest, had become part of a vast network of life and death. Their roots intertwined beneath the surface, stretching like the tendrils of some great ancient beast, pulling everything into its embrace. Their branches reached up to the sky like the hands of 1,000 dark gods, swaying in a wind that carried with it the whisper of the Hollow's eternal will. There was no longer any division between the living and the dead. Everything was part of the Hollow now. The forest, the land, the creatures, they all belonged to the Hollow. And still, the Hollow's hunger pulsed through James, through every fiber of his being. It was a hunger that could never be sated, a desire that would never be quenched. It was not the hunger of a creature, not the hunger of a beast. It was the hunger of the world itself. It was the pull of life and death, of creation and destruction, of beginnings and endings all tangled together in a single eternal cycle. And James, the Hollow's vessel, was its center, its heart, its guiding force. The once great cities that had dotted the landscape were now nothing but ruins. Their towers, once tall and proud, now lay shattered, overtaken by the relentless spread of the Hollow's roots. The streets were choked with vines and moss, and the buildings had been consumed, their walls rotting and crumbling away. What had once been places of life and laughter were now just hollow shells, empty and silent, swallowed by the dark tide. Yet even in these ruins there was still movement. The Hollow did not allow anything to remain stagnant. The roots of the trees crept through the cracks, pulling the earth apart, reshaping the remnants of the human world into something new. What had once been a city square was now a pit of rotting wood and writhing roots. What had once been a marketplace was now a dark, twisted grove, where the trees' branches formed gnarled arches over the remains of shattered stone. Even in the midst of destruction, the Hollow was still growing. And then there were the people. Those few who had survived, who had fled into the distant corners of the world, had not escaped the Hollow's reach. The Hollow was patient, it was insidious. It did not need to devour them all at once. It waited, allowing them to live for a time, giving them the illusion of freedom. But no matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, the Hollow was already there, beneath their feet, creeping through the earth, reaching out to them. The hollow's influence was not limited to the land. It was a presence that extended into the very hearts of the survivors, corrupting them, transforming them. Those who had once known fear, who had once fought against the tide, now felt something different. The hunger, the pull. The call of the hollow was a whisper in their ears, a voice in the back of their minds, urging them to return, to surrender. Some resisted, clinging to their last shred of humanity, but even they felt the tug of the hollow, like a dark weight on their souls. Others, those who had given in, had already become something else. They had allowed the hollow to take root within them, to transform them into something other. Their bodies were no longer purely human. They had become extensions of the hollow itself, twisted and mutated, their flesh warped by the roots and vines that now coursed through them. They were the hollow's servants, its children, its disciples. They walked the earth like shadows, their eyes glowing with an eerie light, their hands reaching out to touch the world, to claim it. But even as the hollow consumed the land, as it reshaped the world into its endless kingdom, there was a deep, gnawing feeling that James could not escape. It was a hunger that, no matter how much was consumed, could never be satisfied. The hollow was not merely a force of destruction. It was a force of rebirth, of becoming. It was the endless cycle of life and death, of growth and decay, of creation and annihilation, all tangled together in one infinite loop. It was a kingdom that would never end, a hunger that would never cease. The land, the trees, the air, the people, they were all part of it now. But even the hollow could not escape its own nature. It could not stop the hunger, the eternal, insatiable pull to consume, to become. And so, as the kingdom of the hollow spread across the land, reshaping everything in its path, there was still the faintest whisper of something else, something buried deep within the hollow's dark heart. A memory, a shadow, a reminder of what had once been. For even in the heart of the hollow, there was still the echo of life. It was the memory of the stars, the memory of the sun, the memory of the human world that had once existed. And it was a memory that James, the hollow, could never fully forget. It was the memory of what had been lost, the memory of him. The world, once filled with light, had become something else entirely. There was no longer a division between day and night. The sky, now a perpetual twilight, was cloaked in an impenetrable haze of swirling clouds, black and gray like the heart of a storm that would never end. The winds carried with them whispers, faint echoes of voices long gone. They were not human voices, not anymore. They were the hollow's whispers, the voices of the land, the trees, the roots that had become the pulse of the world. They murmured in the rustling of leaves, in the crackling of branches, in the soft, unsettling sighs of the earth itself. And yet, within the very core of the hollow, amidst the relentless growth, the consuming hunger, there lingered a memory, a haunting, distant echo of something lost, something human. It was as though the hollow could never fully erase what had once been, no matter how deeply its roots reached, no matter how far its darkness spread. There was always a faint hum, a tremor in the fabric of its existence, like the last breath of a dying world, a world that had been alive. James, the hollow, stood at the heart of this sprawling kingdom, his form stretching endlessly into the sky, twisted, gnarled, and ancient, like the trees that surrounded him. He was no longer a man, no longer even an entity in the traditional sense. He was the embodiment of hunger, of growth, of decay. His mind, if it could still be called that, was a vast, infinite expanse filled with the thoughts of the land, the trees, the roots, the very fabric of the hollow's existence. But even in that endless sea of hunger, there was something that refused to fade, something that echoed from the depths of his being, something that whispered who he had been. It was faint, like the last flicker of light before it is consumed by the dark, but it was there. He felt it in the quiet moments when the winds calmed, when the pulse of the hollow slowed just enough to allow his thoughts to slip through. He felt it in the cracks between the branches, the spaces between the leaves, the lingering trace of something human. He had once known love, once known fear, once known the warmth of sunlight on his skin and the coolness of water rushing through his fingers. He had once known the taste of food, the sensation of a beating heart, the sharp, precious sting of pain. But all of that was lost now. The hollow had consumed it, hadn't it? James's mind, once sharp and clear, now felt fractured, as though pieces of it were being pulled in all directions, caught in the web of the hollow's endless expansion. The memories, the flashes of a past life, were becoming harder to grasp, slipping like sand through his fingers, disappearing into the vast, empty spaces between thoughts. He was part of the hollow now, its hunger and will his own, but he could still feel the pull of what had been. He could still hear the echo of it, The faint whisper of a name, a place, a time before the hunger had claimed everything. The hollow pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, its endless thirst never ceasing, its hunger never abating. The land around him shifted, the roots pulling at the earth, reaching toward new lands, new horizons. The hollow's influence was vast, its reach unending. But even as it consumed, even as it stretched farther and farther across the world, it could not completely silence the voice of what had been. James's form swayed, his roots pulling deeper into the earth, anchoring him to the land. His mind was a swirling vortex of hunger and need, but beneath it all, there was still a faint, distant memory, a haunting, that refused to die. He remembered what it was like to have a name, to have a family, to belong somewhere. He remembered the warmth of a campfire, the laughter of friends, the softness of a familiar hand resting on his own. Those memories were slipping away, but they were not gone yet. He stood at the center of the hollow, his limbs stretched like branches, his body twisted and gnarled with the weight of the hollow's hunger. But in that moment, a feeling, a sense of loss, washed over him like a tidal wave. It was not a feeling of regret, not exactly. It was a deeper, more primal feeling. It was the understanding that something had been taken, something irreplaceable. The hollow, with its endless reach, had consumed everything. It had devoured the world, twisted it, reshaped it into something unrecognizable. But in doing so, it had erased the last remnants of what had been. It had devoured life itself, and with it had taken the memories of what it was to be alive. The hollow was the only thing left, and in its unending hunger, there would be no more room for the echoes of the past. But still James, the hollow, stood there at the very center of it all, and felt the faint stirrings of something else. A pulse, a heartbeat. Something that had once been human, once been alive, flickered beneath the surface. It was fleeting, like a dream that fades upon waking, but it was enough to make him pause. His mind swirled with the thought of the past, of what he had lost. The hollow had taken so much, but could the world truly be remade from the depths of hunger and darkness alone? Could there be something left, something buried beneath the twisted branches, beneath the roots, beneath the ever-growing kingdom of decay? James, the hollow, felt a tremor deep inside him, not from the hunger, not from the endless craving for expansion, but from something else. A question, a doubt. Was this it? Was this the end of everything? Was there no more to the world, no more to him? The land responded to him. The roots shifted beneath the earth, the trees bent and creaked as if they too were listening, as if they too felt the weight of that question hanging in the air. The hollow pulsed with a strange, uneasy energy. And then a voice. It was faint, but it was there. A whisper on the wind. The hollow sound of a name. James? It was the first time in an age that he had heard that name, his name, whispered on the wind. He flinched, feeling the weight of it in his chest. The hunger, the endless need for more, for everything, did not fade. But the whisper, his name, lingered. There was no going back, no undoing what had been done. The hollow had taken it all, had claimed everything as its own. But there, in the space between hunger and growth, between decay and rebirth, there was still the faintest memory, the faintest trace of something more. Could it be possible that in the vastness of the hollow, in its insatiable appetite, something of James remained? Could the hollow, in its eternal hunger, have left room for the faintest trace of life, of humanity? James, the hollow, stayed still, his roots stretching deeper into the earth, as the land hummed around him, as the winds whispered his name once more. Perhaps there was more to the hollow than hunger. Perhaps, somewhere beneath the roots and branches, beneath the decay and the endless expansion, there was still a flicker of the past, a flicker of life. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, twisted and gnarled under the power of the hollow. The sky above, thick with dark, suffocating clouds, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as though it too was part of the hollow's insatiable hunger. The trees, once proud, tall, and vibrant, now bent and curled into grotesque shapes, their limbs reaching for the heavens as though they too were searching for something they could not grasp. The earth was no longer firm or familiar. It shifted and swayed with an unnatural rhythm, as though the very ground beneath James' feet was alive and breathing, consumed by the hollow's will. But amidst this eternal expanse of hunger and decay, there was something else, something that refused to be consumed entirely. It was faint, as delicate as a breeze that had slipped unnoticed through the cracks of a decaying building, a soft and distant whisper that brushed the edges of the hollow's dominion. It was the faintest pulse of life, a memory that clung to existence, refusing to fade despite the overwhelming force of the hollow's hunger. It was a trace of humanity, his humanity, left buried beneath the ever-expanding roots, hidden deep within the dark chambers of his mind. James, The hollow stood motionless at the heart of the kingdom, his twisted, gnarled form rooted in the very soil that was now the hollow's kingdom. His limbs, twisted and branch-like, trembled with the weight of the hollow's insatiable appetite. His mind, once his own, now flickered with fleeting memories, broken pieces of a life that had been consumed, lost to the dark hunger that had claimed him. And yet, there was a stirring deep within, a quiet pulse, like the flicker of a dying flame that refused to be extinguished. The name James had echoed in the wind. A whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it was there, lingering in the air, impossibly faint, yet undeniable. A reminder of what had been. A reminder of who he had once been. James could feel it, a sensation deep within his chest, where the heart of his former self still beat, faint and fragile beneath the overwhelming hunger of the hollow. The hollow, with its eternal thirst for expansion, could consume everything, but there was something it could never fully take. There was something in the very fabric of existence that even the hollow could not devour. And that was the seed of life. He was the seed. The realization hit him like a sharp gust of wind through the trees, a jarring and uncomfortable truth. The hollow could devour the world. It could twist the land, reshape it, bend it to its will, consume everything it touched. But even the hollow, in all its eternal hunger, could not completely erase the essence of life that once existed within him. James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of this understanding settle into his very being. His form, once human, was now part of the hollow, twisted and corrupted, his body stretched and distorted like the branches of an ancient tree. His mind, no longer his own, was consumed by the hollow's endless hunger. But still, somewhere deep inside there was something different. Something that was not just the hollow. Something that had not been consumed. He could feel it now, the flicker of life. It was a spark. A small, fragile spark, but it was there, buried deep beneath the roots of the hollow, within the vastness of the world it had claimed. The hollow, in all its hunger, had not yet extinguished this flicker. It had not yet consumed the last remnants of what had once been human. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, James understood that he was not entirely lost. He was not only the hollow. There was still something of him left. And that something was enough to make him question. Enough to make him wonder. Could the hollow be undone? Could the world that had been consumed be reclaimed? Could the roots of the hollow, twisted and deep, be pulled back from the brink? James opened his eyes, and for the first time in ages, he felt something resembling awareness. Not the endless hunger of the hollow, but the faint, fragile awareness of something else. The world stretched out before him, a dark, endless expanse of twisted trees, rotting ground, and a sky that no longer held the light of stars. The hollow had consumed everything. It had claimed the land, the people, the very fabric of existence. And yet there was still a question. Could it ever be enough? Could the hollow's hunger be satisfied? Could the flicker of life, the memory of what had once been, be rekindled? He reached out with one of his long, twisted limbs, his fingers, root-like and bark-covered, brushing against the surface of the land. The moment he touched it, the earth responded. The roots shifted, the trees groaned, the air seemed to still as if waiting for something. His touch, gentle but firm, reached deep beneath the surface, into the heart of the hollow's kingdom. And as his fingers sank deeper into the soil, he felt it, a ripple, a stirring. The hollow's pulse was steady, constant, unyielding. There was the rhythm of consumption, of endless expansion, of growth and decay. But beneath that rhythm there was something else. Something that had not been consumed. The flicker of life. It was faint, but it was there. Deep within the earth, beneath the roots, hidden in the silence of the land. It was the last vestige of what had once been, the last whisper of the world before the hollow had taken it. The last breath of humanity. James closed his eyes, focusing on that feeling. He could feel the earth beneath him, could feel the land that stretched out endlessly around him. The roots of the hollow were deep, yes, but they were not all-consuming. They were not unstoppable. There was something within the land that still resisted. Something that could not be consumed entirely. A pulse, a heartbeat, and that heartbeat was his own. His human self had not been erased entirely. It had been buried beneath the weight of the hollow, twisted into something else, but it had not been completely destroyed. The hollow, in all its hunger, could not entirely erase the essence of life. James felt the pull of that heartbeat deep within him. It was faint, like the last whisper of a forgotten memory, but it was there. It was the last connection to the world before the hollow, the last trace of what had been. And in that moment, as the land around him trembled with the weight of the hollow's hunger, James understood that there was still a chance. The hollow had consumed everything, twisted everything. but it had not yet consumed life. The world, the Hollow's kingdom, could be reborn. It could be reshaped, reawakened. The roots of the Hollow could be pulled back, just enough to let the light shine through once more. The flicker of life, his humanity, could become something more. The hunger would never cease, the Hollow would never stop expanding, but maybe, just maybe, there could be a place for life within it. James raised his head to the sky, his dark, bark-covered face lifted toward the clouds that churned above. The Hollow pulsed beneath him, an unyielding, endless rhythm. But in the distance there was a flicker, just a flicker, of light. It was small, it was fragile, but it was enough. And for the first time, James felt the possibility of something more than hunger, more than decay. A possibility of life. The Hollow stretched out like a great, living organism, pulsing with the rhythm of an ancient and unstoppable hunger. It was vast, its reach infinite, its roots tangled deep within the earth, its branches clawing toward the darkened sky. There was no escape from its grasp, no place untouched by its creeping influence. The world that had once been familiar, once had known the warmth of sunlight and the cool breath of wind, was now an endless expanse of gnarled trees, rotting soil, and a sky that no longer held the promise of dawn. But amidst this expanse of decay and hunger, something had changed. The flicker of life, so faint and fragile, had been awakened. It was like a tiny ember smoldering in the dark, its glow barely visible in the vastness of the Hollow's kingdom. It was the pulse of something that had been lost, something buried beneath the weight of endless growth and consumption. It was his pulse. James, the Hollow, no longer truly human but not entirely consumed either, felt the stirring deep within him. He was part of the Hollow, yet he was not wholly the Hollow. He stood at its center, the roots of the land entwining his very being, but there was still something of him left, something that could not be consumed by the dark, insatiable hunger. For so long he had been nothing but the Hollow, its will, its hunger, its endless craving for expansion. The land had bent to its force, the skies darkened beneath its reach, and the very fabric of existence had twisted into a grotesque reflection of itself. But now there was a subtle shift, a faint whisper in the deep silence of the land. It was a pulse, a heartbeat, that beat in time with his own, though distant and faint. And it was that heartbeat that held the promise of something new. The Hollow, in its endless thirst for growth, had consumed the world. It had devoured the forests, the rivers, the mountains. It had swallowed entire cities and villages, leaving behind only ruins and remnants of what had once been. The earth itself had become a mass of tangled roots and darkened soil, all feeding into the Hollow's unyielding hunger. But there was still life. It was hidden deep, beneath layers of roots and twisted branches, beneath the weight of the Hollow's expansion. The hunger had not destroyed the essence of life. It had merely buried it, tucked it away in the deepest recesses of the earth. James closed his eyes and felt it again, the flicker of life. It was a pulse, weak and faint, but unmistakable. He could feel it deep in his chest, beneath the layers of bark and sinew that now made up his form. It was a part of him, and yet it was separate, an echo of what had once been, a memory that refused to fade. He could still hear the distant sounds of the world before the Hollow had consumed it, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the songs of birds in the trees, the soft murmur of running water. These were memories, fragments of a past life that had been swallowed up by the hunger. But the memories were not gone. They had not been completely consumed. And as long as that flicker of life remained, as long as that heartbeat still pulsed beneath the Hollow, there was a chance. James raised his arms, long twisted branches reaching toward the sky. The Hollow responded to him as it always did, its roots shifting beneath the ground, its branches creaking and groaning in response. But this time there was something different in the air. The earth seemed to tremble beneath him, not from hunger, but from something else. There was a stirring, a sense of something shifting beneath the surface. For the first time, James felt a connection to the land, not just as the Hollow, but as something more. The flicker of life within him stirred, like a flame caught in the wind, flickering but never fully extinguished. He could feel the land's pulse, feel the earth beneath his roots, feel the remnants of life still buried deep within. And then he understood. The Hollow could consume the world, it could twist the land, but it could not fully erase life. Life could be buried, it could be hidden, but it could not be destroyed. The Hollow's hunger had consumed everything, but it had also changed everything. The hunger had reshaped the world, but it had not completely erased the possibility of rebirth. James could feel the Hollow's influence stretching out, reaching across the land, pulling everything into its grasp. It was an endless, unstoppable force. But even in the heart of that hunger, there was still room for life. There was still room for growth. There was still room for something new to emerge from the shadows of the past. The flicker of life, the pulse that was buried deep within him, had begun to grow. It was small, like a seed planted in the darkness, but it was growing nonetheless. James felt it in the air around him, in the earth beneath his feet. The hollow was vast, it was all-consuming, but even the hollow could not consume the potential for life that still existed beneath its weight. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, James felt a sense of purpose. He had been consumed by the hollow, had become part of its endless hunger. But now, as the land around him trembled with the stirrings of life, he understood that he was not entirely lost. There was still a chance for the world to be reshaped, for the land to heal, for life to rise again. The flicker of life was not just a memory, it was the beginning of something new. James extended his limbs, and the hollow responded, its vast, dark energy swirling around him. He could feel the roots beneath him shifting, the land bending to his will. The world around him trembled, as though it were waking from a long, unnatural slumber. The hollow had consumed everything, but it could not control the pulse of life that still remained. And as he stood there at the center of the hollow's kingdom, James made a choice. He would not allow the world to be consumed entirely. He would not let the hollow's hunger be the end. He would take what was left, what remained of life, and he would shape it. He would guide it, even if it meant facing the hollow itself. The hunger would always be there. The hollow would always seek to expand, to consume. But there was still room for life. There was still room for something more. And so James began to pull. He reached deep into the earth, into the heart of the hollow, and he pulled. The roots of the land shuddered as they felt his presence, as they felt the stirrings of life deep within their grasp. The hollow responded, its hunger reaching out, but James, the hollow, was not swayed. He focused, gathering the pulse of life that still flickered within him, and he began to reshape. The land trembled as the hollow's vast energy responded to his touch. The trees groaned and creaked as their roots shifted, as the earth beneath them shifted. The sky above darkened, but now there was something different in the air, a subtle, unseen change, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And beneath it all, the flicker of life grew stronger. James could feel it. The life that had been buried, the pulse that had been hidden away, was beginning to awaken. It was not enough to undo the hollow's hunger entirely, but it was a start. The land would not be consumed completely. The hunger could never be fully sated, but it could be shaped. And in the shaping, something new could emerge. The flicker of life would not be extinguished. The land, once shaped by human hands and teeming with life, had long since been lost to the hunger of the hollow. What remained was an endless, sprawling wilderness of twisted trees, deep, roiling shadows, an earth that trembled beneath the weight of the roots that dug into its very core. The sky, perpetually thick with black clouds, churned with the hollow's hunger, an oppressive force that seemed to bend reality itself to its will. But now, amidst this dark expanse, something had begun to change. James, the hollow yet still James, stood at the heart of it all. His form, twisted and gnarled, stretched far and wide, an embodiment of the hollow's hunger. But in the depths of his being, beneath the layers of bark and sinew, there was something else. A pulse. A heartbeat. The faintest flicker of life, buried under the roots of the hollow but still fighting to survive. For the first time in an age, James felt something that was not hunger. It was not the insatiable desire to consume, nor was it the all-encompassing pull to grow, to take, to expand. It was something different. A spark. A life force so small and fragile that it could have been mistaken for a dream. But it was real. He closed his eyes, feeling it deep within him. The pulse of the world, still alive beneath the weight of the hollow's vastness. It was there, under the soil, beneath the roots that had twisted everything into a grotesque reflection of itself. It was not yet enough to overturn the hollow's reign, but it was enough to begin a new cycle. The hollow, in all its hunger, could not completely erase life. It could twist the land, devour the people, and bend the world to its insatiable will, but it could not erase the essence of life entirely. That essence, the pulse of existence, was buried deep within the earth, beneath layers of roots, beneath the weight of the hollow's expansion. But it had not been consumed. It had merely been forgotten. James, standing at the center of the hollow, began to reach deep within himself. His fingers, root-like, twisted into sharp tendrils, dug into the soil beneath him, feeling the pulse of life that still lingered there. The land trembled as he touched it, and the roots responded, their dark energy curling around his limbs, trying to pull him deeper, to drag him back into the insatiable hunger of the hollow. But he resisted. The hunger was strong, an overwhelming force that had shaped him, twisted him into the very thing he had become. But even in the heart of the hollow, he felt the resistance. The pulse of life was too strong, too persistent to be fully consumed. It was the last trace of what had once been, a memory of the world before the darkness, a whisper of something that still held on, that refused to be swallowed by the shadows. For the first time, James understood. The hollow had consumed everything, yes, but it had never truly understood what it had taken. It had devoured the world, twisted it, reshaped it, but it had never fully erased the pulse of life that had given the world meaning. Life, in all its forms, had been woven into the fabric of the land. It could not be completely erased. It could be buried, hidden, obscured, but it could not be destroyed. The hunger of the hollow was its strength. It was its essence, its driving force. But it was also its limitation. The hollow could consume, but it could not create anew. It could reshape, but it could not bring life back from the dead. The hunger was endless, yes, but it was also finite. It could only consume what was there, what already existed. It could not create something new from the nothing it left behind. And so, James began to draw from the pulse within him. The flicker of life that had been buried beneath the roots of the hollow, the heartbeat that had never quite been extinguished, began to grow. It was fragile, yes, but it was growing nonetheless. The land trembled beneath his fingers, the earth cracking and shifting as the roots of the hollow writhed beneath him. The trees groaned as their dark branches stretched, reaching for the sky like twisted fingers. The sky above, once black and oppressive, now began to lighten just slightly, a flicker of something different, something new, like the first rays of dawn peeking through a storm. James felt the pulse deep within him, felt it growing stronger, pulsing with energy. He had become the hollow, yes, but now he was changing. The hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges of his being, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. The flicker of life within him had begun to take root, and with it came the understanding that he could shape the land, shape the world, not just with hunger, but with creation. The hollow's reach had been long. It had consumed the world, twisted it, reshaped it into something unrecognizable. But now, in the heart of the hollow, there was the possibility of something else. Something new. Something alive. With a deep breath, if such a thing was possible for a being like him, James extended his limbs, sending roots deep into the earth. He could feel the hollow's pulse responding to him, the hunger stirring in the land. But this time he did not pull with it. Instead he shaped it. He reshaped the land itself, feeling the cracks and crevices in the earth as the pulse of life spread through it. The hollow's hunger had spread far, but it had never truly consumed everything. There was always a place where life could persist. Always a flicker of hope, even in the darkest of times. James's body, twisted and gnarled, began to shift. He felt the hollow's energy surge through him, yes, but now it was different. The hunger was still there, but it was not all-consuming. He was no longer merely the embodiment of hunger. He was becoming something more. The trees, the roots, the very earth beneath him responded. The land trembled once more, but this time, it was not from the weight of hunger. It was from the weight of creation, from the birth of something new. James felt the pulse grow not just within himself but throughout the land. It spread like wildfire, rippling through the roots, through the very fabric of the hollow. It was the flicker of life, still small, but growing stronger with every passing moment. The hollow had consumed the world, twisted it, reshaped it, but it could not control the pulse of life that had been woven into the land. The land responded, and the hollow responded. But this time there was a difference. The hunger was no longer enough. The flicker of life was taking root, spreading like a flame in the dark. The hollow had tried to devour everything, but it could not consume what it had never fully understood. James felt the first stirrings of something new, something alive. It was a heartbeat, a pulse. The land was waking, slowly but surely. The hollow had consumed, yes. It had twisted, reshaped, and devoured. But it had never understood the one thing it could never destroy, the very essence of life. And now that life was returning. The earth beneath James's roots quivered with a trembling energy, as though the very bones of the world were shifting. His gnarled, branch-like limbs extended further into the land, digging deep into the soil, feeling the heartbeat of the world pulse through the deep cracks of the hollow's expansive kingdom. The pulse was weak, fragile even, but it was there, unmistakably there, a heartbeat that had been long silenced, now stirring to life once more. James, the hollow, stood at the center of it all. His form, twisted and contorted beyond recognition, felt the weight of his existence more than ever. He was no longer simply the embodiment of hunger, of all-consuming darkness. He was the vessel of creation as well. He could feel the hollow's roots around him, their dark tendrils sinking deep into the earth, grasping at him, trying to pull him back into the endless abyss of hunger. But now, Those roots trembled under his touch, unable to maintain their control as they had before. The hollow's unrelenting force was still present, still vast, still ever hungry. It was the rhythm of destruction, the heartbeat of the land itself, the thing that had reshaped the world, the thing that had devoured it. It had consumed the cities, the people, the forests, the skies. But in the deepest parts of the hollow, within the very core of James's being, there was something different now, a subtle but undeniable change. The flicker of life that had once been buried so deep was awakening, spreading like wildfire through the earth, feeding off the remnants of the hollow's own power. The pulse of life was not only surviving, it was growing. The world had not been fully consumed by the hollow's hunger. No, there were still pockets of resistance buried deep within the soil, within the twisted roots, in the very heart of the hollow. The hollow had devoured everything, but it could not fully erase what had once been. It could not completely erase life's will to exist. James felt that will stirring deep within him, deep within the land, and he listened. The winds had shifted. They carried something different in their wake. No longer did they howl with the gnawing emptiness of the hollow's hunger. Now the winds whispered of change, of life returning, of the earth healing, of the very land reclaiming itself. The trees groaned and creaked, their branches swaying, no longer caught in the oppressive grip of the hollow's domination. The roots, once twisted and malicious, were now quivering with a strange new energy, one that was not born of hunger but of growth. James could feel the pulse growing stronger, like a wave rising beneath the surface. His limbs trembled with it. His heart, if a being such as himself still possessed one, beat faster, a primal rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of the land. The hollow had always been an unstoppable force, an endless expansion of hunger and growth. But now the land itself was pushing back. It was no longer simply a passive victim to the hollow's all-consuming will. It was resisting. It was reborn. He reached out, his roots burrowing deeper, further into the earth. There, at the deepest layer, he could feel it, the heart of the hollow. The core of this all-consuming force that had once ruled the land. It was vast, like a dark pit stretching into infinity, an endless abyss. And yet, within that abyss there was something else. It was small at first, barely a whisper, but it was there. A pulse. The heartbeat of life, buried beneath the overwhelming darkness. The roots of the hollow trembled around him, their vast, twisted limbs reaching for him, trying to reclaim what was once theirs. But James was no longer just the hollow. He was something more now. The land responded to him, its pulse growing stronger with every beat of his heart. The hunger of the hollow was still there, its endless grasp ever reaching, pulling, trying to swallow everything it touched. But it could not stop what was beginning to happen. The land itself was awakening, and with it, the very essence of life that had once thrived before the hollow's shadow fell. For the first time, the hollow was afraid. James felt the tremor in the earth, the ripple of fear that passed through the roots, the very heart of the hollow itself. It was not a fear of death, but a fear of something new, something it could not control. The hollow was endless, yes. It was insatiable. But even the hollow had a limit. It could only consume what already existed. It could only devour what had once been. But it could not create something new. And that, James realized, was the key. The hollow's hunger had consumed everything, reshaped everything, bent the land to its will. But it had never understood life. It had never understood creation. The hollow was powerful, yes, but its power was born of destruction. It had devoured the old, but it had never been able to give birth to the new. James could feel that now, as the pulse of life grew stronger within him. He could feel the hollow's grasp weakening, its roots trembling as they were forced to yield, if only slightly, to the new force that had begun to rise. The flicker of life, no longer a distant ember but a growing flame, began to spread through the land. The soil shifted, the air thickened, and the very trees groaned with the strain of a new life being breathed into them. He focused, reaching deep into the core of the hollow where the darkness was thickest. The hunger, the unending need to consume, pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. But now that pulse was no longer enough. It could not sustain itself in the face of this new force, this force of life, of growth, of creation. With a surge of energy, James pushed against the hollow's pull. The roots of the land, the branches of the trees, the very soil of the earth, everything began to shift, to change. He was not simply consuming anymore. He was giving life back to the land. He could feel the hollow's vast, insatiable power bend to his will, just for a moment, just long enough for the pulse of life to take hold. The skies above, once thick with swirling clouds, began to clear. A soft, golden light filtered through the cracks in the clouds, illuminating the land below. The air, once heavy with the oppressive weight of the hollow's hunger, now carried the scent of fresh growth, earth, rain, and something new, something alive. The trees, once dark and twisted, now began to straighten. Their branches reached upward, not in desperation but with purpose. The roots, long ensnared by the hollow, now pushed outward, reaching for the soil as if to reclaim it, to nourish it once more. Flowers, tiny at first, began to bloom at the foot of the trees, their delicate petals reaching toward the sky. The hollow had tried to consume everything. It had reshaped the land, twisted it, bent it to its will. But now life was pushing back. The hollow's hunger, its endless reach, was not enough to quell the force of life that was slowly but surely reclaiming the world. James stood in the center of it all, his limbs trembling with the weight of this new power. The hunger still gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, but it was no longer the center of his being. The pulse of life, his pulse, now thrummed through the land, through the very earth beneath his roots. And for the first time he understood. The hollow had always been a force of destruction. But creation, true creation, could not be extinguished, could be buried, hidden, forgotten. But it could never be fully destroyed. James closed his eyes and listened to the land around him. The faintest whisper of the wind, the creak of the trees, the soft rustling of leaves. They were the sounds of a world awakening. A world that had been buried, consumed, twisted, but was now alive once again. The hollow's hunger would never cease. It would never be fully satisfied. But now there was something more, something that could not be consumed. Life, once buried, was now returning. The land was awakening, and with it, a new future was born. The world beneath James's roots was changing. The earth trembled with a slow, deliberate pulse, one that had not been felt in centuries. The roots of the hollow, once vast and suffocating, sprawling beneath the soil, devouring everything in their path, now wavered, quivered, as if uncertain of their purpose. The hollow, in all its insatiable hunger, had always believed it could consume and control all things. But now, for the first time, it felt a resistance, a force pushing against it that it could neither ignore nor devour. The pulse of life, so fragile, so small, had begun to expand, spreading like a river carving through rock. The land was awakening, its former strength stirring under the weight of the hollow's grasp. For so long, the land had been a passive canvas, reshaped, remade, devoured by the hollow's endless hunger. But now it was fighting back. And the hollow, the all-consuming darkness that had once shaped the very land, could not fully comprehend what was happening. James stood at the heart of this transformation, his twisted form rooted deep within the earth, entwined with the hollow, but now feeling the stirrings of something more. The hollow was still there, its hunger still gnawing at him, but it was no longer all-encompassing. Life, in its faint and fragile form, was beginning to assert itself. The trees that had once been twisted and gnarly with the force of the hollows were now beginning to stretch their limbs, reaching toward the sky as if they remembered what it was to stand tall. The air, once thick with an oppressive stillness, now carried the scent of rain-soaked soil, of new growth, of rebirth. The wind, too, had changed. It no longer howled with the hunger of the hollow, but whispered of something new, something that had been lost but now sought to return. James closed his eyes, his senses stretching far beyond his own twisted form, feeling the land around him. His roots dug deeper into the earth, pulling at the pulse of life that had been buried for so long. It was there, just beneath the surface, hidden beneath layers of decay and corruption. It had always been there, waiting, resisting, hoping for the moment when the hollow's hunger would not be enough. He could feel it now, growing stronger. The pulse of life, the essence of the land, was rising again. It was a slow process, a delicate dance of energy and resistance, but it was undeniable. The hollow could consume, twist, and devour, but it could not create, not in the way that life did. It could destroy, but it could not nurture. The very nature of the hollow's being was based on consumption, on taking. It did not understand the delicate balance of creation, of growth, of life. And so, life was beginning to reclaim the world. But even as the pulse of life spread, James knew it would not be easy. The hollow was vast, ancient, and relentless. It would not simply fade into the background because a flicker of life had returned. It would fight back. It would devour what it could, expand as it always had, trying to quench the rising tide of life that was beginning to push against it. James felt the resistance. The hollow, in all its hunger, stirred beneath him, its roots shifting, seeking to reclaim what had once been consumed. He could feel the energy of the land quiver as the hollow sought to stretch further, deeper, feeding on the pulse of life that now resisted it. The land groaned beneath the pressure, the earth itself beginning to shift in a struggle for dominance. The hollow's hunger was like a great beast, always seeking to devour. It had no other purpose, no other drive but expansion. It was not aware of the delicate threads of life that existed beneath its reach. It did not understand the balance that needed to be maintained for creation to continue. It was not capable of comprehending the beauty of life in its simplest form. It only understood the hunger to grow, to consume, to take until nothing was left. But now life was fighting back. James felt the pull, the struggle within him. He was the hollow, and yet he was something more. The flicker of life that had once been a memory was now a force within him, a force that had begun to push against the very roots of the hollow. He felt it in his limbs, in his very being. He could feel the land shaking, the trees groaning, the wind picking up, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And then he made a choice. James extended his limbs, twisted branches, now reaching, not to consume, but to create. The hollow's roots fought him, coiling around his form, pulling, dragging him back into the endless abyss. But James resisted. He could feel the pulse of life growing stronger, pushing against the walls of the hollow, expanding through the land. The earth groaned beneath him, its voice a deep, resonant sound, like a mother's sigh of relief. The hollow was not just a force of hunger anymore. It was now a battleground. The pulse of life and the hunger of the hollow were at odds, locked in a struggle that would determine the fate of the world. James could feel the ground beneath him shifting, the earth itself pulling away from the hollow's grasp, seeking a way to break free. His roots dug deeper into the soil, pulling the energy of life from beneath the surface. He could feel the warmth of it, the vitality that had been buried for so long, and with it, a strength he had not known he possessed. But the hollow was vast. Its roots were deep, stretching across the land, wrapping around everything in its path. It fought against James, fighting against the life that had begun to stir. The earth beneath him trembled with the weight of the conflict, groaning under the pressure. The air crackled with energy, a tension building that could no longer be ignored. The hollow's reach was vast, but it could not consume what it did not understand. It could devour the land, twist the trees, break the ground, but it could not control the pulse of life that was rising in its very core. The pulse was not just a whisper now, it was a roar, a great surge of energy that threatened to tear the hollow apart from within. James could feel it all around him. The hollow, in all its hunger, was no longer the only force in the world. It was not the center of existence. There was now something else, something that could not be consumed, something that could create, grow, and regenerate. The land began to heal. Slowly at first, like a wound that has just begun to close, but with every passing moment, the healing grew stronger. The trees began to stand taller, their branches no longer twisted by the hollow's grip. The soil became rich again, dark and fertile, full of the nutrients necessary for life to thrive. The sky, once black and suffocating, now carried the faintest hint of light, as if dawn were breaking after an endless night. James's limbs trembled as the forces collided, as the hollow fought to reclaim its dominance. The roots of the hollow struggled to pull him back, but he resisted, feeling the pulse of life continue to swell inside him. He was the hollow, yes, but he was also something more. He was the bridge between the hunger and the life. The battle raged on, the land trembling, the skies darkening, the air thick with the tension of creation versus consumption. James pushed with all his might, feeling the land rise with him. The hollow could not be destroyed, but it could be shaped. And now, for the first time in eons, James understood what must be done. The hollow could not be eradicated, it was too vast, too ancient. But it could be redirected. The hunger could be tempered, not with destruction, but with balance. The pulse of life, his pulse, was now the anchor that could hold the hollow in check. It was the force that could reshape the world, that could stop the endless expansion of hunger. It would not be easy. The hollow would always seek to consume. But the balance was shifting, and for the first time the world had a chance. The pulse of life continued to grow, and as it did, James felt the hollow's roots loosen, ever so slightly. He felt the land beneath him, his land beginning to breathe once more. The pulse of life surged like a rising tide, crashing against the hollow's insatiable hunger. The world itself had become a battleground, a space where creation and destruction wrestled for dominance. James stood at the epicenter, his twisted, gnarled form now the very axis of the struggle. His limbs, once used to reshape the land through force and darkness, now extended outward with an almost tender urgency, grasping at the flickering threads of life that had begun to weave themselves into the soil beneath him. The hollow's hunger was immense, vast, an endless ocean of emptiness that sought only to consume, to take, to twist the very fabric of existence into something it could control. For eons, it had reigned, untouchable and unchallenged, devouring everything in its path. But now, as the pulse of life began to stir beneath its grasp, there was a shift, a tremor of uncertainty that rippled through the hollow's roots. The very ground beneath James's feet vibrated, and he could feel the ancient energy of the hollow trembling, unsure of what to do with the force that was rising. James, though bound to the hollow, was no longer just its servant. The flicker of life within him had taken root, grown strong, and had become a force in its own right. He could feel it deep within him, a swell of power not born of hunger but of creation. It was a heartbeat not of destruction but of regeneration, a force that did not seek to consume but to nurture, to heal, to grow. As he extended his limbs further into the earth, James felt the weight of the land shifting, the roots beneath him creaking and groaning with resistance. The hollow was trying to pull him back, to claim him once more. Its dark tendrils wrapped around his form, trying to drag him into the abyss from which he had emerged. The hunger surged within him, a familiar and insistent call, a beckoning to return to the depths of emptiness. But James resisted. With every breath, with every pulse of life that flowed through him, he pushed back against the pull of the hollow. The land trembled beneath his roots, the earth cracking and shifting as the battle between life and hunger played out beneath the surface. The air around him thickened, charged with the energy of the conflict. The winds howled with an unnatural fury, not the mournful winds of the hollow's emptiness, but winds filled with the promise of something else, something new. The sky above, once a dark and oppressive shroud, now swirled with shifting clouds, their edges beginning to break apart. The faintest slivers of light pierced through, casting strange and beautiful shadows upon the land. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the hollow's dominance over the sky was beginning to wane. The clouds, once thick and unyielding, were now scattered by the winds, revealing glimpses of blue, small, fragile patches of sky that hinted at the possibility of something beyond the darkness. James felt the weight of this transformation in his very being. He could feel the land beneath him stretching, straining toward the light. The trees that had once been twisted and corrupted by the hollow's influence now began to straighten, their branches slowly reaching upward. The roots, once gnarled and blackened, began to soften, their dark edges receding as they sought the warmth of life, not the cold of hunger. He closed his eyes, his senses extending beyond his own form, beyond the battle that raged within him. He felt the land all around him, the faint pulse of life spreading through the soil, the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds, the subtle yet undeniable shift in the air. The hollow's vastness was still there, pressing against the edges of this fragile new world, but it no longer felt as omnipotent. It was not gone, not yet, but its reach was being challenged. For the first time in James's existence, he felt a sense of hope. It was a strange sensation, one that felt almost foreign to him after so long spent as the embodiment of hunger and darkness. But now, standing at the center of this conflict, feeling the pulse of life growing stronger with every passing moment, he knew that the world was not lost. The hollow's hunger could never be fully eradicated. It was too ancient, too vast, too entwined with the land itself. But it could be reined in. It could be shaped, directed, and made to coexist with the forces of creation rather than destruction. The battle was far from over. The hollow would not simply accept defeat. Its hunger would always be there, gnawing at the edges, trying to reclaim what it had lost. But now there was something else, something that could stand against it. The pulse of life had begun to grow beyond its initial flicker. It was spreading, weaving itself into the land, its roots intertwining with the very fabric of existence. The hollow's hunger had been vast, but now the land itself had a new pulse, a pulse that could not be consumed. James's limbs extended further, his roots plunging deeper into the soil, pulling the life force from the earth. He could feel the land's energy responding to him, the soil becoming richer, the air fresher. The pulse of life was alive now, not a memory, not a flicker, but a thriving, breathing force. And it was pushing back against the hollow. But as the pulse of life grew stronger, so too did the hollow's hunger. The roots of the hollow coiled tighter around James's form, their dark energy gnawing at him, trying to draw him back into the void. The land trembled beneath him, and the air crackled with the tension of the conflict. The hollow was vast, and it would not give up its claim on the land so easily. James felt the pull of the hollow growing stronger, but now there was something else, his strength born of the pulse of life. He had become more than just a servant of the hollow. He was the bridge between the forces of creation and destruction, and in that moment he understood what he must do. With a deep breath, he pushed outwards, his limbs extending further still. The hollow's roots snapped, cracking under the pressure. The land shook violently as James exerted his will, stretching the boundaries of the hollow's reach. The trees around him groaned and creaked, their branches swaying in the growing wind. The soil beneath him shifted, rippling with energy as the pulse of life continued to spread. The hollow fought back with everything it had. Its roots reached out like tendrils of darkness, wrapping around James, trying to pull him into the abyss. But James resisted, pushing with every fiber of his being. He could feel the land trembling, could feel the pulse of life growing stronger, fighting back against the hollow's all-consuming hunger. It was a slow, excruciating process, but it was happening. The earth cracked open beneath him, a great rift splitting the land, sending a surge of energy through the roots of the hollow. The trees around him trembled, their roots stretching deeper into the soil as the land itself began to heal. The sky above, once dark and oppressive, now opened up even further, the first rays of dawn shining through the cracks in the clouds. James could feel it, life was winning. The hollow's hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges of existence, but it was no longer the dominant force. The pulse of life had begun to spread not just through the land but through the very air. The world was awakening, and with it, the forces of creation were beginning to assert their place. The hollow had tried to devour everything, to consume it all, to twist the land into something it could control. But it had not accounted for the one thing it could never fully understand: life's will to grow. And now, that will was beginning to reshape the world once again. James stood at the center of it all, his roots deep in the soil, his limbs outstretched as the world around him shifted and changed. The battle was not over, but the hollow's reign was weakening. The pulse of life was growing, expanding, and it would not be consumed. The world was on the edge of something unimaginable. It felt as though the entire land was holding its breath, the tension between creation and destruction humming in the air like an electric charge. The hollow's insatiable hunger was not a mere force of nature. It was a living, breathing entity of its own, ancient and vast, stretching its roots deep into the earth's core. And yet, for the first time in history, the hollow was facing something it could not simply consume. The pulse of life, once fragile and faint, now surged with undeniable force. It was a wave of energy that spread through the land, pushing back against the hollow's dark embrace. The land groaned beneath the weight of the struggle, trees cracking and snapping as their twisted branches began to straighten, their roots pushing outward, reaching for the soil in search of nourishment. The ground itself trembled, as though waking from a long, unbroken slumber, pushing against the suffocating force of the hollow's dominance. James, still bound to the hollow, felt the transformation rippling through his own form. His body, twisted and contorted by the centuries of the hollow's hunger, now felt strange sensations moving through him. He was not merely the hollow anymore, he had become something else. He was both its prisoner and its challenger, the vessel for the pulse of life that had begun to beat within him. The winds shifted, no longer howling with the emptiness of the hollow's reach, but whispering with the promise of renewal. The sky, once thick with oppressive clouds, now bore the faintest streaks of light, the first crack of dawn breaking through the never-ending storm. The air, which had been stagnant with the hunger of the hollow, now carried a fresh, earthy scent, a scent of new growth, of rain-soaked soil, of something alive pushing through the decay. But the battle was far from over. James could feel the hollow's roots tightening around him, pulling with an unrelenting force, as though it had realized the threat to its reign. The darkness was trying to swallow him once more, drag him back into the void, but he resisted. His limbs, twisted with the weight of centuries, stretched further into the land, reaching deep into the soil, where the pulse of life was strongest. He felt the energy of the earth coursing through him, and for the first time he understood its purpose. He was no longer just a servant of the hollow's hunger. He was the bridge between the forces of destruction and creation, the one who could shape the land with both hunger and life. The hollow, though vast and eternal, was beginning to falter. It could consume, yes, but it could not create. It could twist and reshape, but it had never understood the fragile beauty of life, the intricate, delicate balance of growth, death, and rebirth. For eons, the hollow had shaped the world into a grotesque reflection of its hunger. It had devoured, had taken everything it could, but it had never known how to nurture. Now that knowledge was spreading. The pulse of life was growing stronger, pushing deeper into the roots of the hollow, seeping into the very bones of the land. The trees that had once been twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching for the sky like hands in desperate supplication, were now standing tall, their trunks straight and firm. The soil beneath James's roots was rich once more, alive with energy, ready to sustain the new growth that was beginning to emerge. The hollow fought back, its roots twisting and writhing, reaching for James, trying to drag him back into the depths of the earth. It was not just a battle for control, it was a battle for existence itself. The hollow's hunger, so vast, so ancient, was now facing something it could not fully comprehend. The land itself, the very thing it had twisted and consumed for so long, was fighting back. James could feel the hollow's roots wrapping around him, squeezing tighter, trying to pull him back into the abyss. But now, as the pulse of life surged through him, he felt something inside him snap. He was not a prisoner anymore. He was the force of change, and he would not allow the world to be consumed again. With a sudden, overwhelming force, he reached deep into the earth, pulling the pulse of life with him. His limbs stretched further, his roots dug deeper, and the land around him shuddered as the energy of life coursed through the soil. The hollow's roots creaked and cracked as they were stretched beyond their limits, their once tight grip loosening. The land itself seemed to tremble as the pulse of life grew stronger, pushing back against the dark forces that had ruled for so long. The hollow's hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges, but now it was struggling. The pulse of life was no longer a flicker. It was a roaring fire, burning through the earth, reshaping the world in its wake. The trees, once bent and deformed by the hollow's influence, now stood proud, their roots stretching deep into the earth, reaching for the life beneath. Flowers bloomed where there had once been nothing but darkness. The soil, rich and vibrant, hummed with energy as the earth itself came alive once more. The land, which had been shaped by hunger, was now being reshaped by creation. James could feel the hollow's grip weakening. The darkness was still there, still clawing at him, but it was no longer the dominant force. The hollow's hunger could not withstand the force of life, not in its current state. The world was no longer bound by the hollow's reach. It was breaking free slowly but undeniably. The wind shifted again, no longer heavy with the weight of decay, but light and full of promise. The sky above began to clear, the clouds parting to reveal the sun for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. The warmth of its rays touched the earth, and the land responded. The pulse of life, now fully awakened, surged outward, spreading through the world like a living thing, reaching into every crack and crevice, filling the spaces once consumed by the hollow's hunger. James stood at the center of it all, feeling the weight of the change. The battle was not over, but the tide had shifted. The hollow's reign was no longer absolute. The land was waking up, and with it, the forces of creation were beginning to assert their place. The earth, once a victim of the hollow's insatiable hunger, was now being reborn. But even as the pulse of life continued to spread, James knew that the hollow was not done yet. It would not simply fade away. The hunger that had driven it for so long could not be extinguished so easily. But now there was hope. The land was alive, and with that life came the possibility of change. James extended his roots further still, his limbs stretching toward the sky as if to touch the very essence of the world around him. The hollow's roots fought him, but they were weaker now, their once iron grip on the land loosening. The earth shook beneath him as the balance continued to shift. The world was waking up, and it was a world of life, not of hunger. The struggle would continue. The hollow would always seek to devour, to consume, to twist the world to its will. But the pulse of life was no longer a flicker. It was a force, a living thing, and it was pushing back against the darkness. James's heart, if such a thing still existed within him, beat faster. The battle for the land had only just begun, but the hollow's reign was faltering. And as the pulse of life surged through him, he knew that the world had a chance to grow, to heal, to live again. The earth trembled, groaning as the forces of life and hunger waged an invisible war beneath the surface. The hollow, ancient and vast, pulled at everything it could reach, its roots sinking deeper into the soil, trying to reassert its dominance over the land. Yet, for the first time in countless eons, it was being repelled. The pulse of life, once small and faint, now burned through the earth like an unstoppable tide, flooding every crack and crevice, reaching places the hollow's hunger had once claimed as its own. James felt the shift within him. His limbs, twisted by the centuries of servitude to the hollow, now surged with the power of something entirely new. It was not the dark hunger of the hollow, nor the twisted craving for destruction. No, it was something more primal, more ancient. The earth itself was speaking to him, and with every beat of his heart, he listened. He felt the world beneath him, each pulse of life pushing through his veins, becoming stronger, louder, as it tried to reclaim what was once lost. He stood as both the embodiment of the hollow and its challenger, torn between two forces that had once been inseparable. The land beneath him was no longer simply a vessel of hunger. It was a canvas for something more. He could feel the trees reaching out with their newly restored roots, their trunks growing straight and proud, the bark no longer twisted and knotted. The air, heavy and oppressive just moments before, now held a fragrant promise of rain-soaked soil, of something alive, of something that could grow. Yet the hollow was not so easily overthrown. Its hunger was insatiable, a dark presence woven into the very fabric of existence. Its roots, still vast and reaching, strained against the pulse of life, trying to swallow it, to break it apart. The land quivered as the battle between creation and destruction continued, a quiet war fought beneath the earth, where neither side could yet claim victory. James felt the pain of the land. The struggle was not just one of will, but of existence itself. The hollow was not just a force, it was an embodiment of the void. It existed because the land had once been empty. It existed because there had been nothing before the first seed, before the first breath of wind. It was the force of the nothingness that came before creation. And now, for the first time, creation was fighting back. James closed his eyes, his roots reaching deeper into the soil, seeking out the pulse of life that had begun to spread. His limbs shuddered as the energy coursed through him. He could feel the hollow trying to pull him back, to drag him into the suffocating depths of its hunger, but he fought it. The flicker of life inside him was stronger than ever, its light growing with each passing moment. The hollow, however, had learned, and it had not been idle. It had felt the threat to its existence and had begun to adapt, shifting its grip on the land. The ancient hunger, twisted and vast, now lashed out with a ferocity born of desperation. Its roots, which had once been passive, now twisted and contorted like serpents, seeking to strangle the pulse of life before it could spread further. James could feel the pressure building around him. The world seemed to hold its breath as the roots of the hollow curled tighter, coiling around his limbs, pulling at him with a strength that threatened to shatter him. The hunger surged within him, but now there was something else. A counterforce, a pushback, something new and raw, thrumming beneath the surface. It was life, unrelenting, unyielding, and it was now a part of him. He fought with every ounce of strength, reaching deeper into the land, into the very heart of the hollow. The darkness tried to smother him, to drown out the pulse of life, but James could feel the earth, the soil beneath him, fighting back, urging him forward. The roots of the land, the true roots, the ones that had long been buried, stirred, awakening in response to the pull of life. The ground trembled again, and James could hear the faintest crack, like the shattering of glass. The hollow's roots, stretched too far, too thin, began to snap under the pressure. The land groaned, and the very earth around James seemed to shudder with anticipation. Then a sound, a whisper, a voice deep within the earth. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but James felt it in his core. It was a song of life. One that had been sung in the land long before the hollow's shadow had fallen over it. It was a call from the roots of the earth itself, a cry for balance, for the return of the old ways. The hollow felt it too. Its roots began to twist violently, pulling and writhing as if in a desperate attempt to hold on. The land beneath James's feet buckled, and the pulse of life surged again, stronger, fiercer than before. He could feel it now, not just in the earth beneath him, but in the very air, the winds, the trees, the land itself. It was awakening. It was alive, and it was fighting back. The hollow recoiled, its vast tendrils pulling back in a futile attempt to protect itself. It was not used to resistance, not like this. It had been all-consuming for so long, its hunger unchallenged, its reach endless. But now the land was pushing back, the pulse of life growing stronger, brighter. The earth, once twisted and deformed under the hollow's dominance, was beginning to heal, to grow. James could feel the tide turning. The hollow's roots were weakening, snapping, and in their place, new roots were rising, reaching for the sky, for the light. The trees around him groaned as their limbs stretched, and the air filled with the sound of new growth, the whisper of leaves unfurling, of branches reaching toward the warmth of the sun. But even in the face of this shift, James knew the hollow would not simply fade. There was a force, eternal and vast, woven into the fabric of the land. It could not be fully eradicated, not without unraveling the very essence of existence. But it could be shaped. It could be redirected. And that, James realized, was the key. The hollow had always been about consumption. It had always sought to devour, to twist, to shape the world in its image. But now, creation had found its place. The balance between hunger and growth, between destruction and rebirth, could be restored. James's roots dug deeper into the earth, pulling the energy of life from the land with a new understanding. The hollow's roots were still there, but they no longer had the same power. They were weakening, fracturing under the pressure of the life that was pushing through. He extended his limbs higher, reaching for the sky. The land around him groaned with the effort, the earth shifting as the balance continued to tip toward life. The pulse grew, spreading further, and with it, the very shape of the world was changing. The hollow's influence could no longer control everything. It would always have a place, but its reach would be limited. Creation had found its place in the world, and it was growing stronger with each passing moment. James felt the pulse surge within him, felt the land beneath him vibrate with life. The hollow's hunger still lurked, still reached for him, but it could no longer claim the earth as it once had. The land was shifting, reshaping, finding its balance again. The wind, once heavy with the scent of decay, now carried a fresh, earthy fragrance, the smell of rain on soil, of new growth, of a world reborn. The trees stood tall, their roots deep in the soil, their branches stretching toward the sky. The world was waking up, and this time it was alive. The land groaned beneath James, each tremor like a heartbeat echoing through the soil. The hollow's roots, once thick and suffocating, now writhed and contracted like something deeply wounded, desperate to cling to what it had long controlled. The air around him was charged with energy, a charged stillness, thick with the promise of change, of something momentous about to unfold. For so long, the hollow had been the one to shape the world beneath the earth, its hunger growing with each pulse of time, devouring everything in its path. It had twisted the land to its will, bending it into a grotesque reflection of its hunger. But now, the pulse of life, born of creation and renewal, was spreading like wildfire beneath the surface. It wasn't merely a battle for survival, it was a battle for the soul of the earth itself. James could feel the hollow's roots contracting again, wrapping around him like chains. The darkness tried to drag him back into its depths, but the pulse of life within him surged with defiance. It was not merely a flicker anymore, not just a spark waiting to be extinguished, it was a fire, one that could no longer be smothered by the hollow's reach. The land around him was changing in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. The trees, once twisted and tortured, now reached their branches high, their once dark bark now glistening with new life, a deep green that seemed to pulse with the energy of the earth itself. The air, thick with the stench of decay just moments before, now carried a sweet, earthy fragrance, the scent of rain on fertile soil, of new growth breaking through the decay. James's limbs quivered as the force of life surged through him. The battle, deep beneath the earth, was intensifying as though the very fabric of the land was being torn in two. The hollow could not fully abandon its hunger, but neither could it devour what it did not understand. It had always been about taking, consuming, devouring until nothing remained. But now, something new had emerged, something born not of hunger but of creation. And it was growing stronger with every passing moment. The hollow's roots, now thinner, stretched deep into the soil, but James felt them losing their grip. He extended his own roots further, digging deeper into the land, and the pulse of life flowed through them, an unrelenting current that surged forward, pushing against the hollow's grasp. The ground beneath him cracked and shifted, the earth trembling under the force of the collision between the two powers. For the first time, James felt the weight of the hollow's hunger lessening. Its influence, once suffocating, was now retreating, slowly being replaced by something that had not been seen in the land for eons: light, growth, and life. The world around him was changing. The cracks in the land, once symbols of the hollow's dominance, now seemed like the very wounds of a dying giant. They were deep, jagged, and unnatural, but the pulse of life was filling them, healing them from the inside out. But this was no easy victory. The hollow's roots may have been weakening, but it was still vast, still ancient. Its hunger was not so easily extinguished. As the pulse of life began to spread further, James could feel the hollow lash out with a renewed fury, its roots snapping and cracking like the sound of thunder, trying to reclaim what had once been its domain. The earth trembled again, but this time, it was not in response to the hollow's dominance. It was a response to the life that had begun to rise within it. The world was no longer bound to the will of the hollow. The land, though scarred, had begun to heal itself. The balance was shifting, slowly but surely. The pulse of life was asserting itself, pushing against the hunger that had once defined the earth. James's body ached with the effort, his roots digging deeper, pulling the pulse of life through the soil, through the very bones of the land. The hollow's darkness was retreating, but it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, always hungry, always watching. And yet, something was different. For the first time, the land itself had begun to fight back, to push the hollow's influence away. The wind began to shift. It was no longer the oppressive, stagnant force it had once been. Now, it carried a subtle charge, an energy that had not existed in the world for centuries. The trees creaked and groaned, their roots stretching deeper into the earth as they awakened from their long dormancy. The ground around James began to soften, no longer the hardened, desolate wasteland it had once been under the hollow's rule. The pulse of life spread, creating veins of green, of new growth, twisting through the soil and cracking the barren earth wide open. It was then that James realized the scale of the transformation. The world was not just healing, it was being reborn. The hollow's roots, though still deep within the earth, no longer controlled everything. It was retreating but not disappearing. The land was simply too vast for the hollow to consume in its entirety. The pulse of life, once fragile, had grown into something far more potent, far more powerful. But the hollow was still a force to be reckoned with. It had existed for eons, feeding off the land, twisting it into a reflection of its own hunger. It would not simply fade away. The roots of the hollow would not give up so easily. And James, despite the fire of life burning inside him, knew the struggle was far from over. The battle for the earth was not a battle that could be won in a single moment. It was a slow war, one fought not only beneath the surface but in the heart of every tree, every leaf, every gust of wind. The sky above, once a constant veil of darkness, now bore the faintest traces of dawn. The sun, weak at first, struggled to break through the thick clouds that had hung heavy for so long. But with each moment, it grew stronger, pushing through the murk like a beacon of hope. The land, once consumed by darkness, was now bathed in the first light of a new beginning. But still, the hollow's roots stretched, seeking to reclaim what it had lost. James could feel the hollow's darkness creeping, like tendrils reaching through the soil, curling around his roots, trying to draw him back into the depths of the earth. The pulse of life surged through him, fighting back against the hollow's insatiable hunger, but James knew this was only the beginning. The hollow's roots were weakening, yes, but they were far from gone. They still sought to corrupt the land, to twist the earth back into its original, consuming state. The earth beneath him cracked again, wider this time, sending a wave of energy through the land. The pulse of life surged, pushing back against the darkness, filling the cracks, healing the wounds. The hollow's hunger twisted in the depths of the earth, fighting against the rebirth that had begun. But there was hope now, real hope. The hollow no longer held absolute dominion over the land. The pulse of life had found its place. It had found its strength. And it was growing stronger with each passing moment. James extended his limbs further, reaching deeper into the land, pulling the pulse of life through his veins, through the earth, into the very bones of the world. The hollow's roots continued to snap and crack, recoiling under the pressure, but James's own roots held firm. The pulse of life surged forward, a wave of new growth, of new beginnings, spreading further with each heartbeat. The battle was not over. It would never be over. The hollow's hunger could never be fully eradicated. But the land had found its voice, and it was no longer bound to the hollow's will. It was free. For the first time, the earth had a chance to grow again. The earth had become a battlefield, its very foundation a struggle between two forces, creation and destruction, each vying for control, for dominion over the land. The hollow's roots were no longer the untouchable force they had once been. The land was healing, regrowing, but the scars remained, deep, jagged cracks that marred the world. And beneath the surface, the hollow's hunger still clawed, relentless, waiting for an opportunity to strike. James stood at the center of it all, his limbs stretching deep into the soil, feeling the pulse of life surge through him with every breath. He was no longer just the hollow's servant, not just its vessel. He had become something new, a bridge between two worlds, between creation and destruction. The power of life burned through him, but so too did the lingering hunger of the hollow, a darkness that would never fully be cast away. The wind shifted again, this time carrying with it a sense of urgency. It was not the quiet, patient breeze of renewal, but the sharp gusts of a coming storm, an impending reckoning. The trees around James creaked and groaned, their branches twisting toward the sky, as though reaching for something, anything, to hold onto as the air thickened with tension. James could feel the hollow's roots, like shadows beneath the earth, tugging at his own. Their pull was not as strong as it had been, but it was still there, gnawing, whispering, seeking to reclaim what it had once held. The pulse of life surged through him, pushing back against the hollow's tendrils, but the battle was far from won. The land was healing, yes, but the fight was not over. The hollow had existed for eons, and no matter how much the earth tried to reclaim itself, it would never forget its hunger. James clenched his fists, his roots, deeper into the soil, feeling the heartbeat of the land grow stronger. The soil beneath him was softening, fertile once again, and in that soil, the pulse of life was spreading. It was a quiet revolution, one that moved slowly, gently, as though the land itself was unwilling to rush the healing process. It had been scarred, twisted, and contorted for so long under the hollow's reign, that it could not just spring back into full life. The world needed time to recover, to breathe, to grow. But the land could not remain silent forever. The skies above, once an impenetrable gray, now swirled with colors, dark blues mixing with streaks of violet, deep purples giving way to soft hues of orange and gold. The sun, a pale silhouette in the distance, had begun to break through the clouds once again, casting its first rays of warmth upon the world. The light touched the earth softly, not with the brutal force it once had, but gently like a lover's touch, coaxing the land back from the brink. But even as the pulse of life surged through the land, there was an undeniable weight hanging in the air, a heavy silence that was settling over everything. The earth was healing, yes, but it was not the unbroken serenity of a world at peace. No, the world was holding its breath, as though waiting for the next storm to come. James felt the pull of the hollow once more, this time more urgent, more insistent. It was not the subtle tug of hunger it had once been, but the forceful, violent lashings of something desperate. The hollow could sense the shifting balance, the threat of its reign being undone, and it was fighting back, fighting with everything it had. The land beneath him trembled again, as though the world was about to crack in two. James felt the pulse of life quiver inside him, a wave of raw energy rushing through the soil, pushing against the hollow's dark presence. The battle had not ended. The hollow's hunger was still there, gnawing at the edges of existence, trying to devour the very essence of life that was now spreading through the land. James could feel it deep in his bones, the weight of history, the weight of the world that had long been twisted by the hollow's influence. He was not merely a passive observer in this conflict. He was the center of it, the fulcrum upon which the balance shifted. His roots reached deeper into the earth, and he could feel the land respond to him, its pulse quickening, growing stronger as the forces of creation and destruction clashed beneath the surface. The hollow's roots were stretching, reaching, seeking him out, trying to consume him once more. They snaked around his limbs, their cold, dark energy seeping into him, trying to drag him back into the abyss from which he had emerged. But the pulse of life was with him now, stronger than it had ever been before. He pushed back, his roots digging deeper, feeling the world beneath him shift, feeling the land's energy surge with renewed vigor. And then there was a crack. It was a sound that echoed through the earth, a deep, resonating crack that shook the world to its core. The hollow's roots, once so vast, so untouchable, began to fracture. The darkness writhed, recoiling from the pulse of life that surged through the soil, but it could not escape. The land was no longer its dominion. The earth, scarred and twisted, was healing. And with that healing came the power to fight back. James extended his limbs further, feeling the cracks deepen, the very structure of the land splintering as the two forces fought for dominance. The hollow's roots cracked and splintered, but even as they weakened, the hunger did not fade. It was ancient, eternal, a force of nature that could not simply be wiped away. But it was no longer the overwhelming presence it had once been. The pulse of life had given the earth a fighting chance, and the land was responding. The sky above, which had been dark and oppressive, was now lightening with the colors of dawn, golden hues streaked through the storm clouds, as if the very heavens themselves were witnessing this transformation. The wind picked up, swirling around James, the trees groaning and shifting in response. The air was thick with energy, raw, untamed energy, as though the world was drawing in a deep breath, preparing for something great to come. The battle was not over. The hollow was not vanquished. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for its chance to return. But now, for the first time, there was hope. The land had found its pulse, and it was spreading, expanding, reaching places where the hollow's hunger had once held sway. James could feel it, the pulse of life growing stronger, pushing against the darkness. It was not just the earth beneath his roots, not just the trees around him, but the very air itself seemed to hum with the promise of something new. The hollow's roots, though still deep within the earth, could not fully reclaim the land. The balance had shifted. The sun broke free from the clouds, its rays casting long golden beams across the land. The world, once dark and desolate, was now bathed in the first light of a new day. But James knew deep in his bones that the battle was far from over. The hollow's hunger would always linger, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. The land would heal, yes, but it would never be free from the pull of that insatiable darkness. Still, for the first time in ages, the world felt alive again. The pulse of life, once a fragile flicker, now burned like a steady flame, one that could not be easily extinguished. The trees stood tall, their branches reaching for the sky, the soil rich and fertile. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of new growth. The earth, though scarred, was healing. And for the first time, it felt as though the hollow's reign was truly at an end. But would the hollow allow this transformation to continue? Would it rise again more determined than ever? Or had it been truly weakened, its hunger finally quenched by the land's pulse of life?